Yeah. We're calling it All My Relations, Learning to Live in the Family of Earth. And in our parish, we've been paying a lot of attention in recent years to both environmental justice and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. And as we began to plan this year's season of creation, it occurred to those of us who are the planners that these are two ways of looking at our world that are very connected. We recognize that our largely white settler parish, in our celebration of creation, needs also to deepen our understanding of Indigenous worldviews about creation, in addition to our ongoing commitment to reconciliation. So we approached Cynthia Wesley-Esquimaux, who is an Indigenous scholar and educator, way last February, and asked if she would be open to teaching us some things about an Indigenous understanding of the relationship of human beings with the earth from both a spiritual and cultural perspective. We recognize that Indigenous nations would have some variation in their spiritual views of connection to the earth, but we imagined that there would be commonality in them as well. So Cynthia graciously accepted that invitation. And then, with her agreement, we asked Sylvia Keesmaat, as a Christian theologian and biblical scholar, if she would join us to respond to the Indigenous perspectives that Cynthia brings, reflecting on how these Indigenous perspectives can inform our understanding of the biblical teachings on our relationship to the rest of creation. So at the time, it became apparent that what was originally conceived as an in-person workshop in the parish hall of the church would instead be the Zoom-based event that we've gathered forth this morning. So we're calling this morning's workshop, at Cynthia's suggestion, What's in a Worldview? From Creation Stories to Trickster Tales. So let me introduce the presenters. Dr. Cynthia Wesley-Esquimaux is appointed as the first Indigenous Chair for Truth and Reconciliation in Canada at Lakehead University, and continues to develop pathways forward to reconciliation in Canada. She is an adjunct assistant professor for the Faculty of Anthropology and maintains a status-only appointment at the University of Toronto's Faculty of Social Work. Her teaching and academic writing is directed towards understanding and resolving the continuing transmission of unresolved intergenerational trauma and grief, primarily within the Indigenous community. Cynthia is a director of the Teach for Canada, a nonprofit which addresses the needs of Indigenous schools in Northern Ontario. She was inducted as an honorary witness by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada and is a member of the governing circle for the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation at the University of Manitoba. She's a member and resident of the Chippewa of Georgina Island First Nation in Ontario, and has dedicated her life to building bridges of understanding between peoples. She sees endless merit in bringing people from diverse cultures, ages, and backgrounds together to engage in practical dialogue and applied research initiatives. She remains deeply committed to public education and active youth engagement from all cultures and backgrounds. Dr. Sylvia Keesmaat is a biblical scholar, farmer, activist, and writer. Sylvia teaches in an adjunct capacity at Trinity College at the Toronto School of Theology. She is the co-chair of the Bishop's Committee on Creation Care in the Diocese of Toronto, and is the co-author of Colossians Remixed, Subverting the Empire, and Romans Disarmed, Resisting Empire, Demanding Justice. Sylvia has her permaculture certificate and speaks widely on issues related to climate change, forest gardening, permaculture, and biblical themes related to justice and the marginalized. She lives on the traditional lands of the Michisagig Anishinabeg on an off-grid permaculture farm with her husband, Brian Walsh, and a fluctuating number of animals and people. So let me give you a little outline of how we'll spend our time this morning. Right after this introduction, I'm going to turn it over to Cynthia, who's going to talk to us for about 45 minutes or so. And then Sylvia will have a chance to respond and reflect on what Cynthia has said. After Sylvia has finished her piece, then we'll have our bio break. And then Cynthia's will have an opportunity to then reflect back on what Sylvia has said. And then we'll spend the rest of the time on Q&A from you. Now, since there are too many participants to have an open, unmuted discussion, we're asking that you could write your questions in the chat, and our Zoom moderator this morning, Amber Owlin, will keep an eye on that, and they will be read for the benefit of everyone. So Amber, before we go on, is there anything that you need to say about how this is going to work, the logistics of how this is going to work? Or have I covered everything?
I think you've got it. Nothing to add.
Okay, thank you. So without any further delay, I'm going to pass it over to Cynthia Wesley-Esquimaux.
Okay, well, thank you. Good morning, everybody. The first thing I want to do is say my name properly for you so you know what it is. It's Cynthia Wesley-Esquimaux.
Oh, thank you.
It's not a French word. It's actually indigenous. It's probably sort of anglicized at some point over time, but it essentially means the buzzing of a mosquito. So it's Esquimaux. Anyway, thank you so much for the invitation this morning. There's a lot of different kinds of things I want to talk to you about. I'm going to be reading a creation story to you, so hopefully that will mean something to you. And I think it's a really interesting conversation to be invited into. I mean, it's not the first time I've had this conversation, but it's the first time I've actually had to do it on Zoom. So it gets to be a little bit interesting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to you. I'm going to read something from a Catholic, from the Lakehead. And I'm going to read that. And then the reason I want to do that is because I kind of want to set the stage for what's actually going on across Canada. We're having conversations with multiple churches and multiple communities of churches, sometimes all together, bringing each other into a circle to have this conversation, because in fact, they do see some similarities in how we view the world, you know, what our worldviews look like, sometimes what our creation stories are about. So in this instance, probably Genesis and the woman who fell from the sky, both creation stories, both very much about similar kinds of things like water. You know, we're born from the waters, and quite often it's, you know, that's the imagery that we all start with, is this massive body of water and maybe some creatures that are present in it. And then the sky, you know, the whole question of the sky and the universe, or the multiverse, as some of our elders talk about it, and how it you know, we look at it and we need to be informed about it. And so we bring those stories to life to be able to explain some of those phenomena in a way that's positive for us. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to read the creation story. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the prophecy that some of our elders have talked about from 2012 up to the present, and how that looks, and some of the things in it that will be very familiar to you as citizens living in a world that is very modernized, but yet has been called, you know, from long ago by people who had visions about what was coming and what it would look like. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the Trickster pieces and why the Trickster is so important to you and to us. And we all have them in our backgrounds. We all have them in our creation stories and in our day-by-day stories. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the 7 values that we all live by, or should be living by, I suppose. And then we're going to hand it over to Sylvia, and Sylvia's going to make the comments that she needs to make or wants to make. But I wanted to draw some parallels initially, because I think it's really important to understand that. So this was sent to me by Archbishop Emeritus Sylvain Lavoie. For some of the work that we're doing across Canada is actually working with the Catholic Church to put together a module or some kind of teaching tool so that they can actually work with their communities about reconciliation and some of the stuff that's going on in Indigenous community. And so I've highlighted a few things that I wanted to read out and also to contrast it. So the first statement in the Laudato Si is this sister now cries out to us because of the harm we've inflicted on her by our irresponsible use and abuse of the goods which God has endowed her. We've come to see ourselves as her lords and masters, entitled to plunder her at will. And you know, just the fact that it opens with this sister, as opposed to from an indigenous perspective, which is Mother Earth, it was interesting to me because at the same time, the sister kind of puts us at an equal standing, which is something I think is important. But it also means that we see ourselves a little bit higher in the hierarchy than maybe indigenous people might. This is a striking comment. It connects with indigenous spirituality. It serves as an example of what Naomi Klein also expressed in her groundbreaking book, This Changes Everything. And she notes how the issues faced by indigenous peoples and their efforts to deal with these issues are now serving as a unifying force with non-indigenous peoples. What used to separate and divide is now uniting us because we're all concerned about the environment. And Pope Francis is one of the many strong voices beginning to unite with indigenous voices in speaking out for the care of the environment. So he talks about three critical elements of indigenous worldview, which resonates with the contents of the Laudato Si. The first is the conviction that human beings are not at the top of creation, but rather at the bottom. And again, you know, when we talk about that kind of a thing, I would say more equal to as dependent beings of creation. We're all in this together. So, you know, at the bottom would be a rather humbling position. The second reality is the presence of the worldview of the sacred, as opposed to the Western worldview of the scientific, in which everything can be explained. But we have our creation stories, which do the same kind of thing. For the indigenous person, everything is sacred and spiritual and beyond the merely rational and objective. And it's actually mostly subjective from an indigenous worldview. Thus, for many, the northern lights are not just ions and electrons colliding, but rather seen and felt as the ancestors dancing in the sky. Third element is a strong conviction that we're all related. And the Cree expression, all my relations, is what is said by participants when they emerge from a sweat lodge, signifying they've just connected with all of creation during the ceremony. All of creation, not just the other human beings that are in the sweat lodge, but all of creation, meaning everything from what we would call stones that are actually alive to every animal and being on the planet. So biblically, Genesis tells us we have to have dominion over all of creation. And theologically, we're taught that we are to exercise prudent stewardship over creation. Within an indigenous worldview, we're invited to walk in a harmonious and what we would call balanced relationship with all of God's creation. And that's something I think that we've lost sight of, is this idea that we are to walk in a harmonious method, but we're also to have a balanced expression of that. So one of his friends, Patriarch Bartholomew, spoke in particular of the need for each of us to repent of the ways in which we've harmed the planet. And that's some of the things that we're going to be talking about today. For human beings to destroy the biological diversity of God's creation, for human beings to degrade the integrity of the earth by causing changes in its climate, by stripping the earth of its natural forests, destroying its wetlands, for human beings to contaminate the earth waters, its land, its air, and its life, those are regarded as sins. But Pope Francis adds, if we approach nature and the environment without this openness to awe and wonder, if we no longer speak the language of fraternity and beauty in our relationship with the world, our attitude will be that of masters, consumers, ruthless exploiters, unable to set limits on our immediate needs. By contrast, if we feel intimately united with all that exists, then sobriety and care will well up spontaneously, because all creatures are connected. Each must be cherished with love and respect, for all of us as living creatures are dependent upon one another. And this certainly resonates with the indigenous worldview. So there's a whole lot of pieces in there. Pope Francis may never have exercised indigenous ministry in Canada, but he has a pastoral approach, and his ecclesiology and his view of the world and the environment certainly resonates with the best of that tradition. And he proclaims that the natural environment is a collective good, the patrimony of all humanity and the responsibility of everyone. If we make something our own, it is only to administer it for the good of all. And I think that is a sobering, important reminder to us as a closing of this particular reflection. If we make something our own, it is only to administrate it for the good of all. So we're reminded through those kinds of comments that it's not just about the indigenous people being stewards of the land. We take that responsibility very seriously, but it is about all of us taking responsibility and understanding that everything that happens we take action and there's a reaction. So we're seeing an incredible bit of damage done to the world, and we don't want to continue to see that happening. So these conversations are important for those very reasons. They mean that we have to take advantage of the opportunity to be allies in this conversation. And Indigenous peoples across Canada are absolutely open to that consideration. You know, I mean, maybe not everybody, because there are certainly situations going on in First Nation communities that I know you are aware of. You know, there's a continuing struggle to work with many of the colonial impacts, to work with federal agencies, to work with child welfare, you know, to work with the continuing addictions, mental health concerns that are growing through this pandemic. So there's a lot of things that are going on that mean that people cannot turn external and look at you and invite you in, because internally there's a lot going on and they have to deal with that. It just means that there needs to be a consideration of the external world for those impacts and an understanding. So the things that happened in Montreal last week, for instance, with this woman who died in the hospital, with the nurses saying horrible things to her about her, you know, that she's only good for sex, and that her children would be ashamed of her, and all these pieces without any sense of being wrong somehow or being heard. They didn't even care. Those are the kinds of things that we all have to step up and say, no, that cannot happen. That we have to do something about that. That doesn't equate to equality or equity or support or balance. It just doesn't. So those are the kinds of things that we're talking about it. And we're not asking you to come in and save us. I think that one of the things that we've said very clearly to people is we want to work together, which means that you have to do your work in your community and we have to do our work in our community. And when we have opportunity, we should come together. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to read a creation story to you, because I think it's this is part of the conversation, is actually where do people believe they came from, and what are those things that we talk about that makes some sense to all of us. So I'm going to read this, and you're not going to be able to see me throughout this actually, but I will be here, and then I'll move through it as quickly as I can, and then we'll have a conversation. But I'm actually going to read it to you. So this is called, so what's in a worldview? Well, let's just talk a little bit about that. Everything is in a worldview. Oops, I'm gonna do it this way. There we go. So what does a worldview cover? Well, it basically covers everything. From our perspective, a worldview is everything that happens to you as you're growing up, everything that's happening to the people around you, everything that they say, everything that they do, everything that they show you, every place they take you. So it's the social dynamics of the environment in which you're being raised, and hopefully that's positive and not negative. The politics that are experienced in your community or in the country in which you live, the philosophy of the people that live there, the religions that they practice, or the spiritual practices that they adhere to. It encompasses everything and is affected by everything. And so if there's a negative thing that happens around that, so for instance, in my own life, my parents were raised in residential schools. Growing up, I had to contend with a lot of the issues around addictions and violence because of those experiences. So yes, it colored my worldview in a very profound way as I was growing up, when I looked at other people and who they were, or who they were in relation to me as an Indigenous woman. So, or child really at that point. So those are really important pieces. But worldview, everybody has a worldview. Everybody in the world has a worldview, different, but basically it's there, and it's important for you to acknowledge it. We want to talk about creation stories because creation stories are so important to our understanding. And creation stories in many instances are not necessarily speaking to the conscious mind. In many instances, they're speaking to the unconscious mind. They're creating an opportunity to be soothing and to fill in the blanks, or to answer the questions that we have about how the world came to be and how it came to be the way it is. And so it's important that we have that. For many of us in Canada, probably the United States as well, we see this continent as Turtle Island. And there's a reason why we say that. And then that's the story that I'm going to talk to you about, is this continent as a turtle. And sometimes you can look at the outlines of it, and people have traced it in a way that make it look like that. And plus we have a lot of stories that have been put together around the shell of a turtle, and the 13 squares and the 13 moons that we also understand. And so there's this whole bunch of things that are absolutely related to this particular story. But not all Indigenous stories feature a turtle. So there's lots of other kinds of different stories and beginnings. You know, there's the raven, and how the people came out of a shell, and the raven was standing on the shell and welcomed them to this particular world. The Haida, Haida Gwaii was created and brought light into the world. Sedna, an ocean spirit whose fingers created all the sea creatures. It's an Inuit creation story is very different because of the environment in which they live. So creation stories often come out of the places where people actually are created, are born. And if they're born on a seashore, if they're born in a field like the Haudenosaunee, which is where we are going to be talking about the Haudenosaunee creation story. The Anishinaabe also have earth digger stories that are very similar, a muskrat or some creature going down and pulling up earth from underneath the waters and then putting it on a turtle's back. So it's quite similar. For the Innu people, can't say that, but the Wolverine making land out of rocks and mud. So sometimes it's animals and sometimes it's other things. And sometimes it's about tricksters and they're beginning the world. So there's lots of ways that it can happen. But the main part of it is that it's about how humans learned valuable life lessons to be on this planet, how they learn to interact, how they learn to create relationship, and how they learn to create families and communities and nations. Those are the reasons we tell those stories. So I also wanted to share with you, so it's just a little bit of prophecy to start off with, because again, I think it's important for the context of this particular conversation. This idea that, well, I'm just going to read it. Upon suffering beyond suffering, the red nation shall rise again, and it shall be a blessing for a sick world. And we know we found ourselves in exactly that place today with a lot of the extreme weather events and the climate change. A world filled with broken promises, selfishness, and separation. A world longing for light again. I see a time of 7 generations when all the colors of mankind will gather under the sacred tree of life, and the whole world will become one circle again. I salute the light within your eyes where the whole universe dwells. For when you are at that center within you, and I am at that place within me, we shall be one. And again, lots of references to many of the things that are in our creation stories, the 7 generations back, 7 generations forward, and our responsibility to humanity and to the planet on which we live. All of the colors of mankind. It's not just about us. We're all in this together. The sacred tree of life, which is illustrated in many, many creation stories across the country, and the circle, that will all be one circle again, and it will not be broken. And the light within your eyes where the whole universe dwells, because when we say quite often, where is the creator? Where is the creator? Creator is what we're doing this very moment. The creator lives within all of us. It's very important parts of that story. Okay, so I'm going to start the story. So this is a Haudenosaunee or Iroquois creation story, and I think it's a good one, and I think you'll enjoy hearing it. So long ago, in the world we are in now, we believed that there was no land, just water and creatures of the water and some of the air. But up above, there was a place called the Sky World. In Sky World, there were beings that were in some ways like human beings, and in some ways they were very different. The beings in Sky World had more powers and strength than human beings have. For instance, they could make things happen just by thinking about it. There was a tree growing in the center of Sky World called the Tree of Life. On the tree grew many different kinds of fruits and blossoms, and that tree glowed with a beautiful light that lit up Sky World. The beings in Sky World were told not to disturb that tree. But one day, a woman who was expecting a baby asked for a drink of tea made from the roots of the tree. When her husband started to dig near the bottom of the tree to get at the roots, the dirt caved in, and some say the tree fell down, creating a massive hole in the floor of Sky World. And this was terrible. The woman went to see what had happened. Some say she lost her balance while gazing and fell into the hole. Some say she knew she was destined to go through that hole, her insights coming from dreams she had had, so she jumped. Some say she was pushed. Nevertheless, when she did fall, she grabbed some seeds from around the Tree of Life. Because she fell through a hole in the sky, many people refer to her as Sky Woman. Down below, there was a flock of water birds flying through the air. Some say they were geese. Some say they were blue heron. Some say that they were swans. One of them looked up and saw Sky Woman falling. He spoke to the other birds and decided to make a great blanket with their bodies and catch her on their way back on their backs. When they caught her, they tried to bring her back up to Sky World, but she was too heavy, so they lowered her into the waters below. A giant turtle said that they could put her on his back, that his shell would be able to support her And so that's what they did. And this is the reason some people call North America Turtle Island. Sky Woman thanked the creatures, but she said she needed land in order to survive and help other nourishment to grow. She explained Skyworld to the creatures and described things that were in existence in Skyworld and how she would need some of them in order to continue her life in the new world here. So one by one, the water animals dove down to try to get dirt from deep underneath the water. Some say it was the muskrat, and some say it was the otter. But finally, one creature was successful in bringing a few grains of dirt up to Sky Woman. She placed the dirt on the back of the turtle and she stood up. She sang and danced in a counterclockwise direction. And as she did this, the turtle's shell grew and grains of dirt multiplied. She dropped the seeds from the tree of life and they started to grow right away. When she finished dancing and singing, there was land and plant life as far as she could see. The continent grew from here, and this is why it looks like it the way it does. So some more time went by, and Sky Woman gave birth to a baby girl. Time went on, and the baby girl grew up with the insights of her mother and knowledge of both worlds. She was told not to walk towards the west by Sky Woman, for she knew something was lingering there, but one day the daughter did. A wind started to blow from the west, and a cloud started to move towards the daughter. The daughter saw the outline of a male being in the clouds. The daughter, from astonishment, fainted. When she woke up, she found 2 crossed arrows lying on top of her stomach. She'd become the bride of the spirit of the west wind, and now she was going to give birth to twin boys. Those boys were very special. After all, their grandmother was Sky Woman, and their father was the spirit of the west wind. The boys could talk to each other while they were growing inside their mother, and they didn't always agree with one another. When it was time for them to be born, the right-handed twin was born in the usual way. However, the left-handed twin decided to push his way out through their mother's armpit, killing their mother and leaving Sky Woman, their grandmother, to raise the boys. They buried their mother, and from her head grew what we now know as the 3 sisters: corn, beans, and squash. These are the staple foods of the traditional Haudenosaunee diet. From her heart grew sacred tobacco, which is used when there is a desire to communicate with the Creator. From her feet grew the wild strawberry, which is known as big medicine. Even in her death, the mother of the 2 boys still made sure they had what they needed to survive. She came to be called Mother Earth, and to this day, she still supports all of the people, animals, and plants. The twin boys grew up and went about the task of creating everything that is found in the natural world today. They made rivers, flowers, animals, and eventually they made human beings. The left-handed twin became the keeper of the night, and the right-handed twin became the keeper of the day. During creation, a series of trials, tribulations, and competitive times occurred amongst the brothers, but when they were done making their creations, everything was in perfect balance. When grandmother Sky Woman passed away, the twins flung her head into the night sky. She is still there, and today she's called Grandmother Moon. She reflects light at night. She helps the people keep track of time. She controls the rise and fall of the waters. She keeps company with the stars and the left-handed twin, the keeper of the night. She regulates the monthly cycles of all female life, which guarantees that new life will be born, making her the leader of life-giving. When the human beings were made, they were meant to be the caretakers, and they were supposed to make sure everything stays in balance. And there you see a really good image of that as it was handed across. However, it seems the human beings kept forgetting what they are supposed to do. The human beings needed to remember to take only what they need and leave the rest for the future generations to enjoy and experience. The human beings are the ones who forget that everything in the natural world is connected and is part of the same web of life, and so should be respected and honored daily. It is the duty of all the people of the world to respect their original instructions and take care of their Mother Earth. And I put up a picture of Noah's Ark because as I thought about all of the water and the floods and all the kinds of things that can happen, there's water in so many of our stories and so many things that come out of those stories that make so much sense to us about the animals and the need and the value of having those animals replenished and being a part of our world. And unfortunately for us at this period of time in our lives, we're actually, I think, killing more animals than we're saving. But it's a great story, and it's I guess it's as unbelievable a story as a story of the woman who fell from the sky. But the point is not that it's unbelievable or that it's not true. The story is that it helps to explain a time for us that we have no other way of explaining, at least in the time of that of the creation story, and of course Noah's Ark. And also, you know, the entire surviving human race descended from Noah's 3 sons, somewhat like the brothers and the woman who fell from the sky, and their creation, their ability to create creation of the planet, on the planet, I suppose, which was very important. So we also want to talk a little bit about tricksters. So that's the creation story, and I think it's an important part of our conversation. But in the creation story are these other elements, and certainly the trickster is one of them. And one of the things that our people are trying to do is to reawaken the trickster, bring back the creation stories for our young people so that they have a sense of their culture and their history and the strengths that were there, the goodwill and the strengths that were there. And the trickster is about conscientiousness, it's about consideration, and it's also recognition of how foolish we can be as human beings and the mistakes that we make, and how, you know, we're part divine because of our ancestry and the tricksters that are in there, but we're also very human, and we're very much a part of the planet and the people that are here as well. So it's a really interesting way to look at it. Thompson Highway, some of you may have heard of him in his book. Actually, I don't know if it's in his book. He might have just said this to me, but he said, you know, when he says when contact happened and people started to arrive, the trickster got drunk and passed out under the table, and where he's still there, we need to wake him up and bring him back into our lives, and not forget his significance and importance to the way we live our lives. And we believe that the worldview that we express and or pull back into and transform into something much more positive, and those creation stories are important to the health and well-being of our people and of your people too, because even if you don't consider yourself a tribal person or even indigenous, there's still tricksters in your history, and those stories need to be brought back and told to your children and your grandchildren so that they have a sense of the world being a safe place, because it is quite dark sometimes. And those stories help people to laugh at themselves and understand that sometimes things look pretty awful, but yet at the same time, they can look pretty good. So those are important parts of the consideration for the stories that we're talking about today. Sometimes the tricksters are not persons like Nanabush. Sometimes they're actually coyotes or other kinds of animals. And there's this contrariness that's often told in the stories that are related to us. You know, if you go this way, I'm going to go that way. If you want that, I want the other. You know, if I'm going to do this dance, you know, you're going to do something else. So there's often a contrariness there, and this idea of slipping out from under domination and control of others, and actually doing your own thing, determining your own direction, making your own life. They're central to the worldview of many Indigenous peoples, and they actually stir things up quite a bit and make things interesting. And they're very positive, powerful teaching tools, because they don't speak necessarily to the conscious mind. Quite often they speak to the unconscious mind. And if somebody's telling a trickster tale, if there's 10 people in the room, 10 people will hear 10 different things or get 10 different things out of it. So it's an important part of the conversation. Also, there's this whole question, transformative powers of tricksters and of those creation stories and the things that happen in them. That you know, there's different stories about a man who wanted to marry a beautiful woman, and she rebuked him, and then because he was ugly, and then he runs away, and when he meets a medicine man, the medicine man is able to turn him into the most handsome man alive. And when he goes back to his village, and the beautiful woman now wants to marry him, he doesn't want her anymore, and he marries somebody else. It's actually more appropriate. So there's all kinds of things about transformation and moving through the world and changing directions, and also changing yourself. When I was growing up, there was also stories about things like bear walkers, of people who could transform themselves from a person into a bear and do things to other people. Quite often that was what we considered bad medicine as opposed to good medicine. But it was there, and it was used, and maybe sometimes it still is, depending on again where you're hearing your stories from. The transformative powers, and also our ability to transform our communities from the places where they are and the struggles that they have, and into something stronger and future oriented and looking better in its delivery. So there's lots of ways that we look at this from that perspective. Also, the whole representation of good and evil are in those trickster tales and in those creation stories, and the ability to move in either direction, that we have choice, that we can do many things, and some of them are not necessarily good things, and sometimes we can transform those bad things into good things. So there's a real powerful message there as well about this, and important for many of our young people, because some of our young people get directly out of child welfare, age out into poverty, and age out sometimes right into jail. So there's this sense that they have that they're bad, that they're evil, that there's no salvation for them. And sometimes we have to step in and bring them back to the drum, and bring them back to their creation stories, and bring them back to the teachings and to the sweat lodges, so that they can actually create that transformation from seeing themselves as something bad to something good, and having that strength. So there's lots of power in these stories. Powerful medicines that exist there that can be drawn out, metaphors that are very important representations for the unconscious to savor and develop. And many times the stories are told very differently. Children's stories can be funny, how the skunk got his stripes, how the squirrel got its fluffy tail. Like, there's stories that help children understand the world around them in a very immediate sense. But in those stories to children are also lessons about choices that they might make, and the things that they might do. So, whether they're naughty or whether they're good, those stories are there to help them find another way, or to heal what might have happened. The other level is teenagers, giving them the kind of guidance they need to be able to make. Again, it's about choices, about sexuality, about parental relations, and listening to what they're told, and learning from what they're offered by their parents. And then, of course, stories for adult consumption, which very clearly speak to the need to be kind, and the need to be careful about what they do, and to never hurt a child and never hurt a woman, not to kill each other. Like, there's a lot of powerful messaging in there that helps people understand that they have to behave. And some of the stories are told, when there's marital discord, when people are fighting with each other, and they're reminded, these are your responsibilities as a woman, these are your responsibilities as a man, these are the things that we would like you to do. So there's often those kinds of pieces as well that are there there's something for everybody, right? And many times it's elders telling these stories who have been through these experiences and have the ability to take those experiences and make them something that people will understand. So I guess my question for you after all of that is, will we begin to understand? Whether we're looking at a book like the Bible, or whether we're looking at trickster tales or creation stories, whether we're looking at things that we really don't understand or haven't had any access to, will we begin to understand and to accept? I think that's probably one of the biggest questions, is, can we accept and understand each other through that acceptance? Or will we constantly try to change each other to accommodate our ways? And I think, as you know, in history, that has happened many times, where the church has insisted that indigenous peoples change and adhere to those tenets, whereas you would never meet an indigenous person that will say, you have to be like us. I don't think it's ever happened, and I don't think it ever will. We accept you and the work that you do. My feeling on it is, if a certain kind of a religion works for you, it works for me. I'm not going to try to change you and ask you to do things differently. And we don't appreciate it, I guess, when we're told that we have to do things differently because somebody else says it's better. So there's lots of conversations that have to happen there around that understanding. But what will happen is, it'll take us to a better place. Because if we don't start to understand and accept each other, we're going to burn up the planet. We're not going to be able to work together. And many of the prophecies that I'm going to share with you next actually speak to those pieces. They ask you to take some consideration around the choices that you make, to listen to what indigenous peoples have said. Indigenous knowledge has many things to offer you about understanding the planet and the multiverse, understanding the things that we can do and the things that we have done, and where we might be able to go from here. So I'm going to stop sharing here with the PowerPoint, and I want to share with you some of the prophecies before we take a break. I think we're good. We want to take some breaks. So I want to talk to you about Thomas Banyaka's prophecy, and then I'm going to go into some of the other ones. So Thomas Banyaka is a Hopi prophet. I've heard him speak before. He lived for many, many years, well over 100 years old, and went around the world basically talking to people. And he talked about he talked about many teachings, but he talked about prophecies like the land will be crossed by snakes of iron. And he said has arrived. And for me, it's like, is that the railroads that he's talking about? Perhaps it's the pipelines that are involved in so many fights with indigenous peoples. But essentially, snakes of iron. And again, you can make into that whatever you'd like, but you have to realize that when people were saying those things, they were describing something that they knew nothing about. They could see something, but they didn't really know what it was. In the Hopi teachings, he said, we're told that towards the end of the world, Spider Woman will come back and she will weave her web landscape, and everywhere you will see her web. And this is how we will know we're coming to the end of this world, when we see her web everywhere. I believe I have just seen her web. Now, that was his reaction to seeing the Robert Moses Niagara power plant, which sends electricity from the Niagara Falls generating plant throughout western New York. That passage is from a book called Thinking in Indian, John Mohawk reader. I have given your Karen a list of books, and if I haven't, I will, that you can actually look at that will give you some of these insights and access to some of these stories. But he traveled extensively around the world teaching this prophecy. So the Spider Woman and the web that she weaves, could that be power lines? Could it be the internet, a truly immense web that now covers the entire world? Again, it's subject to interpretation. There are other teachings from other nations that are also relevant. In 2012, the world was crying about the Mayan apocalypse and how the world was going to end. But we believe that Mayan weren't actually predicting the end of the world. They were predicting the end of the world as we knew it at that time. And we might do well to pay attention to that because we're seeing what's happening in the last decade, and those predictions in 2020, are relevant in 2012 as they were in 2012. But they're interesting to think about because those Mayan predictions came from, again, thousands of years ago. And this is what he also had to say about the 9 signs. So he said that the first sign said that the white-skinned man would come. And of course, that's already happened. The second said, our lands will see the coming of spinning wheels filled with voices. And he says in his youth, his father saw this prophecy come true with his eyes, white men bringing their families in wagons across the prairies. But from my perspective, like, what might those spinning wheels filled with voices represent? Right? Wagon wheels, records, DVDs. It's an interesting concept. And I'm like, oh, okay. So how would we interpret that from this perspective in 2020? And the rest of the signs he listed were the third sign as a strange beast like a buffalo with great long horns will overrun the land in large numbers. These white feathers saw with his own eyes the coming of the white man's cattle, so that they took over the land. The fourth sign, the land will be crossed by snakes of iron. And I think that was the railroads. In the fifth sign, the land shall be crisscrossed by a giant spider's web. And that's what I think is the internet, but who knows. The sixth sign, the land will be crisscrossed with rivers of stone that make pictures in the sun. I don't know. The seventh sign, you'll hear the sea turning black and many living creatures dying because of it. This is the eighth sign. You will see many youth who wear their hair long like my people come and join the tribal nations to learn their ways and wisdom. And this is the ninth and last sign. You'll hear of a dwelling place in the heavens above the earth that shall fall with a great crash. It will appear as a blue star. Very soon after this, the ceremonies of my people will cease. And they're not alone when it comes to those kinds of prophecies, but it's interesting, again, you can take it or leave it, but it's interesting that there were people living, hundreds, maybe even thousands of years ago that were seeing these kinds of things coming, and they had no way of explaining it, but they wrote it like that, or somebody wrote it down finally and actually codified it. The other book that I think you should look at that's very interesting in the context of prophecy is Jonathan Lear's book, Radical Hope, Ethics in the Face of Cultural Devastation. He talks about Plenty-Coup. Plenty-Coup was a chief of the Crow Nation. And in his story, he talks about when the buffalo went away, the hearts of my people fell to the ground and they could not lift them up again. And after this, nothing happened. And the interesting thing about that is, of course, many things happened after that. But from his perspective, when he says nothing happened, it meant that the ways of life that his people had been living were now over, and they were not able to actually live the way they had, and their stories died, and their people died, and their ways of life died. And so he went on to actually become a minister of the church and lived a very long life. I don't think he died until he was in his 90s. So clearly things continued, but for him, and in the story that he tells, for them, the end of the world was when contact happened and everything stopped as they knew it. And the final thing I want to say, a prophecy piece I want to share with you is Dave Christian, who is still alive, Anishinaabe elder, founder of the Turtle Lodge in Manitoba. And he says prophecies aren't always negative. I mean, it's not only about, frightening everybody and saying, this is the end of the world and this is how it's going to happen. Basically, he says, we were given instructions on how to live and how to behave. And we strayed away from those original instructions. What we're finding in the world today through the signs that nature is offering us is that we need to reflect on our own behavior. And then this comes back again to Pope Francis. We have to think about, what are we doing? Or how are we treating life? And how are we treating each other as human beings? And it's really parallel to the Mayan calendar in 2012 when they talk of the new cycle that's coming. And when you hear so much talk about the end of the world. And then we've entered into this pandemic. There's massive fires burning, there's floods, there's all kinds of things going on. And the question is, we need to reflect on our behavior. Are we reflecting on our behavior, or will we burn up the planet? So he doesn't see the end of the world as an ending. He sees it as a beginning. So he says the end of the world can also be understood that we're being given an opportunity to put an end to our negative behaviors. And he says, noting the cycle will mean a return to indigenous values, that in fact, we're going to take you back to the land. These changes are going to be somewhat difficult for those that have lived the materialistic life, because this new life the elders are talking about is a return to laying down values and principles that whatever we create in our life must be grounded in those values. The principles of our understanding of the survival of the people have always been based on peace, harmony, and respect of all life. So it's an interesting thing that, we're having these conversations today about all of these pieces, because these are the kinds of things that are actually something that we all have to think about. And finally, I wanted to share with you, again, not an Indigenous person, but something that is worth, again, thinking about. There's an article written by Dorothy Wood, and she's the cultural editor of the Tyee, which is a really interesting, I guess it's a journal, tyee.ca. And it's out of, she's actually writing on critiquing the book of ecological virtues, living well in the Anthropocene being the fact of what we're doing right now, if you want to look into that. But his essay, she critiques his essay, worthy of this mountain living a life of friction against the machine. And it's an experience that David Chang had on an Alaskan cruise when he was witnessing the beauty of the landscape. And at the center of the essay is a thing of blessed silence, Mount Fairweather, impassive, dignified, magnificent, and not uttering a single word. And in it, he found his moment of conversion. And he says, if one strives to live a life worthy of the mountain, by challenging the systems that threaten its beauty, one must reform one's internal habitus, a form of conditioning under the aegis of modern society that prevents us from embracing a life of radical simplicity and deep respect for the earth, while also countering the external channels that reinforce a given way of life. Illumination is the word that Chang uses in reaffirming his commitment to what he calls planetary vitality. But how do you go about this, especially if you're living in the midst of a large, loud urban center? And Chang cites a number of big thinkers, including Aristotle, Michael Foucault, and Shinya Suzuki. But ultimately, his own arguments are quite simple. And he says, in order to live a life of friction against a human-made industrial machine that's now grinding both us and the rest of the planet into dust, first, you have to see it for what it is. As Chang asserts, resistance has to go deeper than simply railing against the exteriors of the thing. It involves remaking the internal landscape of human beings. In short, in order to change the world, we must first change our minds and also our bodies. We need to peek beneath the surface of our own physical and mental conditioning and understand that we create culture as much as culture creates us. Like a fish that does not feel the weight of water, his dispositions are subsumed into common sense, which accepts reality as self-evident beyond dispute. We create culture as much as culture creates us. It's relatively simple, straightforward, but even questions like, should I eat meat, drive a car, have children, all carry with them spider webs of ethical consideration. To this end, a reminder from Aristotle proves instructive. Anything that we have to learn to do, we learn by the actual doing of it. People become builders by building and instrumentalists by playing instruments. Similarly, we become just by performing just acts. temperate by performing temperate ones, bravely, brave by performing brave ones, not just by thinking, but doing, and doing without getting self-righteous or preachy about it. And which brings me to where I want to conclude. It brings us to the 7 sacred grandfather teachings or values. And there are 7. The first one that I always list is courage, that we have to have the courage to step forward, to stop bystanding, to get involved, and to do whatever we possibly can, even if it's within our own household only initially, and then out to the larger world eventually. We have to have the courage to step forward. We have to have respect for ourselves, and we have to have respect for other people. And that means challenging our own biases and beliefs, challenging those stereotypes, challenging what we were told, and sort of reframing that into something more real and more inclusive. We have to have humility. We are not the answer. We are not on top of the scale of everything. We don't own the world, and we don't certainly control or are not in charge of the animals. We're at an equal distance. We're all dying. It's not just them or us. So we have to have humility, no matter how educated we are or how enlightened we think we are. We have to have humility and be able to accept help and give help to those around us. That there are truths in the world, that our truth is not the only truth, that there are many truths, and we need to embrace all of them. And we need to understand those worldviews and those stories so that we can actually do something together. And we need to be honest. We need to be honest with ourselves, and we need to be honest with others. We need to be able to ensure that our consciences are clear, that we understand that, yes, we made mistakes. Yes, we've done things that weren't so great, but let's be honest and try to do things better in the future. And those 5 things can take you through to love. They can take you through a love of humanity, a love of the planet, a love of the earth, a love of each other. And when you learn those 6 and you master them, those are the things that take you through the wisdom. And we don't get to wisdom. We don't get to that knowledge, that expansiveness, that inclusiveness until we master the other 6. And those are the 7 sacred grandfather teachings that we live by, that we try to teach our children on a regular basis. You go to any school with indigenous kids in it, they're all around the walls. Those kids can actually quote those. The question is not about quoting them, though. The question is about living them. So I want to leave it at that, and I'm going to hand it over to Karen, and Karen's going to hand it over to Sylvia. And I hope that, I mean, it kind of goes a little bit quick, but we'll come back and I'd be happy to have you ask me questions or you know, critique whatever you think is there, and let's make it really interesting and dynamic. So I'm going to hand it back over to Karen, and Karen, you can take it from there. Thank you.
Okay. Wow. A lot to ponder. So I'm just going to turn it over to Sylvia. I know Sylvia's got a lot to say in response, so let's not take any more time away from her.
Great, thank you. Sorry, am I unmuted? Yes. Okay. I've got a window there. Okay. Technology will continue to stymie me. It's good to be here, and thank you, Cynthia, for an incredibly rich presentation that immersed us in a whole bunch of different things, the indigenous story and the prophecies. And I'm just going to pick up on a couple of things, because I think this is a topic we could talk about for a very long time. So I want to pick up, start by talking about where you began, which was worldview, and the worldview through which we read a text or hear a story or indeed live our lives. And for many of us in the Christian tradition, we have been reading our origin story, our creation story, through the lens of the Greek philosophers. This was the worldview that came to dominate how the Bible was interpreted. So Plato, who had incredible, whose ideas had incredible currency early in the 1st century, had this way of thinking about the world that was incredibly dualistic, right? There was heaven above and the earth beneath. The soul was above and the body was beneath. Men were above and women were beneath. Rationality was up above, and emotion was of a lower order. And of course, women were down there with emotion and with the body, and with nature that was considered to be lesser. The physical material world was less important than abstract thought. Women were down below, of course, because they were tied through menstruation to the natural world. Every month they were affected by the moon, whereas men, however, were rational, abstract beings not connected to the earth at all, apparently. And so you had this kind of dualism that meant that when the Bible was read, when the creation story was read, those categories were imposed upon the story. So there was a sense that, for instance, being created in the image of God, that meant that human beings were rational. That's how it was interpreted. It wasn't interpreted that people did the same things that God did in the story, because if you looked at what God did and in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 in the creation story, it's a story where God broods over the water, calls this abundant world into being, gives it as a gift to humankind. In Genesis 2, God actually gets down in the stuff of the earth and creates a human being and plants a garden. And none of these things were emphasized through these Platonic glasses that we wear when we're reading the text. Not God as gardener, or God as somebody who works in the mud, or God as, potter. None of those things. It was God as rational being that became emphasized. And part of what these glasses did was then tell the story in such a way, not just that image of God became rationality, but also that human beings became the apex of the story, particularly male human beings. They became kind of the top of the story. So the way the earth functioned was kind of as a stage for human drama, for the human story, for the male story. So you have God at the top, humanity in the middle, and the earth down here, which just happens to be there so we have a place to do what we need to do, right? Like the stage at the end of the gymnasium, right? It's just there so the drama club can mount their plays. That's what the earth and what creation was for. It was the background. And it became then a story of human privilege and human control. So that language of domination became the language that shaped our relationship to the earth. And the language of subjugation became the language that shaped the earth. And what this did was it created a perfect context for Christianity to become. And there's a lot more about how the story was interpreted, but I'm just going to stick with the creation story for now. It became the perfect context. It's not even the perfect context. It gave license to the church itself to become hierarchical, to take on the structures of empire under Constantine in the 3rd century. But then it also legitimated and enabled the church in its colonial and imperial task of dominating the whole world. So when Columbus and all those missionaries, and Columbus himself considered himself to be on a mission from God. God had blessed this mission. The Pope had prayed over this mission. When Columbus came and discovered the New World, and I put quotations marks around that because, of course, there was nothing to discover. There were people here already. When he did that, he had this worldview that had biblical sanction for control and domination. First of all, of the natural world, because we can't kid ourselves that this was about mission. It was about finding resources more resources to send back to the pockets of the colonizers in England, Holland, where my roots are, France, Portugal, Spain, right? That's what the resources of the New World were for. And Christianity had a central role in playing in this. The Pope, through the doctrine of discovery, this was a papal bull that the Pope wrote, and somebody else probably wrote it, but the Pope signed it, saying that any lands to which Christians came that were not occupied by Christians became the property of the crown, of the country, of the Christian country that had conquered it. Right? That's the doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery is still appealed to in law in North America today, in both Canada and the United States. It is still the basis by which we disenfranchise Indigenous peoples of their lands. And it is a religious statement. The other way that the legitimation of taking land away from Indigenous people happened was through the idea of terra nullius, which is the idea that if people aren't using the land in the way that Christian conquerors would use the land, it's actually empty. So if land isn't being put under what we would call cultivation, isn't harvested properly, isn't being farmed, then there's nobody there. Nobody's doing anything to that land, and it's considered empty. The state of Israel handily borrowed this idea from Canada when it decided that Palestinians were not actually in the land when the state of Israel was established. In fact, Canada's laws around Indigenous peoples have been borrowed by both the state of Israel to help them disenfranchise Palestinians and in the establishment of apartheid in South Africa. So this is one of Canada's great exports to the world. So there was this religious basis, which was rooted in a certain interpretation of the biblical story that became the legitimation for what happened to Indigenous peoples in Canada, and the legitimation for saying that the land was a commodity. And because the land is a commodity, it can be bought and it can be sold and it can be bought again, right? It is not something that we live in relationship to, but it is something that's there for us to exploit. And that's because man is the dominant creature and the dominator of creation. So that's the story. That's the story that animated what happened when the colonists came to North America. And you can see that if that's your story, encountering a creation story like Cynthia just told us about Sky Woman, living in harmony with all of creation, the twins establishing this harmonious balance that humanity is supposed to keep in creation, that doesn't make any sense. In fact, that becomes a story that's easy to take advantage of if your worldview is this Platonic worldview. However, that isn't the only way of interpreting these Genesis texts, right? Platonism was an imposition on the text. And if we pay attention to the Genesis story, and if we ask ourselves, what if we strip ourselves of these preconceived ideas that rationalism is the be all and end all, and that heaven is important, more important than earth, and that there's something wrong with the body and there's something wrong with creation? What if we strip ourselves that the soul is more important, right? I mean, this has been the central problem of Christianity. We've been so heavenly minded that we're no earthly good. I mean, if all you want to do is have a soul that's going to go to heaven after you die, why would you care about what's on the earth? That's the kind of theology that comes out of this misreading of the biblical story. But I suggest that's a fundamental misreading of the story. So if you go back to the biblical story, if you read Genesis 1 more carefully, you'll notice that creation is actually a partner with God in creating things. So Genesis 1, God creates the earth, and then God calls the earth to bring forth all living creatures. Just like the daughter of Sky Woman brought forth the three sisters and the sacred tobacco and the wild strawberry medicine. So God asks the earth to bring forth all living creatures and the plants. God asks the water to bring forth the sea creatures. So that when we get to the point where God says in Genesis 1:26, let us create humankind in our own image, later theological tradition says, oh, that must refer to the Trinity. That's what God's talking about. But God has just told the earth and water to bring forth things. I think when God says, let us bring forth humankind, God is speaking to the earth, because that's what happens in the very next story, right? In the very next story in Genesis 2, God gets on God's hands and knees and sculpts humankind out of the earth and then breathes spirit into that creature. Just like the west wind breathes into the daughter in the story. And of course, in Hebrew, the word for spirit is ruach, which is the same word as wind. And later biblical authors pick up on this by saying, God, when you send forth your spirit, it renews the face of the earth. And the double entendre there is, God, when the winds blow, you renew the face of the earth, right? That the very wind is the spirit of God. So in Genesis 2, God breathed God's spirit into that creature made of the earth, and humankind is created. Humankind becomes a living being. We are made of the spirit of God and the stuff of the earth. And the word that the text uses for us is Adam, and the word for earth is Adamah. We are Adam from Adamah. We are earth creature. And that's what, I love listening to Cynthia's story. There's the sky woman and the west wind. And there's the creatures in the story are named after parts of creation. And that's what the beginning of Genesis does too. The earth creature from the earth. That's what God created. And this isn't there's no sexual binary here in this person. It just means, usually Adam is translated as man, but it's actually just earth creature. The binary is created later when Eve is created. And then you have Isha and Ish, man and woman. So that's one, important point about who we are in the story. We are brought from the earth, and the way that God talks to the earth in Genesis 1 suggests not this hierarchical God, humanity, and then earth, but it's a triangle. God at the top, and then humanity and the earth are equal on the bottom of that triangle. And that holds for the whole biblical story. You have all kinds of places in the Bible where God talks directly to the stones, to the trees, to the waters. You have all kinds of places in the story where the waters praise God, the trees clap their hand, the ground calls out to God. All of these things suggest that God's relationship with the earth is not mediated through humankind in this story. There's a separate connection that the earth has to God, and there are arrows going in all directions in this diagram. I might even have, no, I don't have this diagram. Sometimes I hold things up to the screen because I'm kind of old school. Now, the other thing that's very important about this story is this language of dominion. The Hebrew word there is actually, and then the language of having rule. It's actually the language that's used for a shepherd who has rule or mastery over the sheep. And in the ancient world, the shepherd is somebody who actually lived with the sheep and moved with the sheep. So the shepherd, yes, had a different role than the sheep, was not a sheep, but that wasn't a kind of mastering control to exploit the sheep. If that had happened, the flock would have died. This is a loving care, a service of the animals in which the shepherd found himself. And Genesis 2 makes that point even clearer. Genesis 2:15 says, God put the earth creature in the garden. And garden might be a bad translation there, because when the garden is described in Genesis 2, it's all trees, right? God called forth trees to come from the earth. So what we actually have here is something more like a food forest, something more like North America was, Turtle Island was before contact. Right? When indigenous peoples hunted and gathered and ate the nuts from the trees and the berries from the shrubs and took the maple syrup from the trees, all of the trees that forested this land. That's the kind of context the earth creature is put in. And God says, or God puts the earth creature in the garden, or in the food forest, let's call it, to tend and to keep. And a better translation of that is actually to serve it and observe it. This is keep in the sense of keeping the law, observing the limits of something, right? Randy Woodley, who's an indigenous biblical scholar and permaculture farmer in Portland, Oregon, talks about in indigenous traditions, you have the keepers of the traditions and the keepers of the teachings, who learn the teachings, but then their lives are in service of those teachings and passing them on to other people. That's the sense of keep that we have here. This is observing creation, knowing what its limits are, so that we actually know how to serve it. This is what we're called to do, to serve and observe creation. Now that's incredibly different than having a license to dominate and exploit, right? That means that we need to be paying attention to creation around it. We need to be learning from creation. And we need to be realizing that creation will teach us how to live faithfully in service of creation. And tied in with this is that when God kind of gives authority over creation to the human creature, God says, I'm giving you every plant that has seed in it, every seeding plant that has seed, I'm giving you it for food. And every fruit that has seed in it and that seed, I'm giving to you for food. And it's a really tightly wrought poem that repeats the word seed over and over again, at which point you might want to figure out that the text is trying to tell us something. Our job is to protect the seed supply. That's what we're called to do. God has said, and of course, all those plants are given to every living creature as well for food, not just humanity. Later in another creation account in Psalm 104, which I'll be preaching about tomorrow, and I've sent the file off to Redeemer, so I hope it arrived. It's clear that God has set apart certain parts of creation for food for different creatures. And when we destroy the food of those creatures, we are destroying something that God has ordained, right? It's not all for us. This isn't all about human beings. Another way to kind of get at this whole question of domination or authority is just to ask, we've tended to impose our North American, or not just North American, actually, this goes all the way back to the Roman Empire, to the Greeks, the ideas of authority having to do with mastery and control. And again, this is rooted very much in a male-centric culture, a patriarchal culture. But the biblical story, whenever it talks about how God exercises authority, turns that on its head. Right? In the biblical story, God acts with authority when God forgives. God also judges, but always to bring new life. When Jesus comes, Jesus says to the disciples, those other peoples, when they act with authority, they act like tyrants over you. But when you have authority, you act as a servant to one another. You offer up your life for one another. That's the kind of service that Genesis 1 is calling us to for creation. Those are the kinds of sacrifices we are being called to make for the sake of serving creation. And of course, there's all kinds of other repercussions that fall out of our Platonic reading of the worldview that we use for Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 in the story. For instance, how we view sin, and this is interesting because this is where the first trickster actually comes into the biblical story, right? The snake, who speaks to the woman and is that trickster and kind of makes a suggestion to her, and she takes the suggestion. And the interesting thing is, if we're looking through those abstract worldview glasses, we talk about the story in abstract. So what was the original sin? It was it was hubris, it was pride. Like, there's all these words that are attached to it, without really noticing that original, what we call the original sin, was actually a radical culinary indiscretion. It was taking something from a tree and eating it when they had been told not to. It had to do with eating food inappropriately. It had to do with eating food out of season. I actually think that God had intended to eat from that tree with the earth creature and explain good and evil, because everything in the Bible happens around a meal that's of any importance, right? Last thing Jesus does with the disciples is have a meal. Moses teaches about Sabbath around manna in the wilderness. Abraham is told he's going to have a son in a meal with angels. Meals are like, that's where everything important happens. This happens in our own lives too, right? It's, when you're kind of having a meal together, your family either, does really well or falls apart, one or the other, depending on your context. But just why meals can be fraught. I think God intended that kind of a meal, but the earth creatures ate out of season. And ironically, this continues to be the single most common way that we destroy the earth right now, is we eat out of season. Our agricultural practices, more than anything else, are causing the destruction of the rainforest, the destruction of fertile land as topsoil goes off. And this is something we're actually learning from the indigenous peoples of the places where we live, can help us live in that right balance, in that right harmony with the earth again. Because indigenous peoples where we live know what's in season, know what the things are that grow well in season. Where I live, there's a huge debate right now over wild rice in Pigeon Lake. James Weetung, who is Anishinaabe from Curve Lake First Nation, who I've had to speak into my classes before. James is a great character, a great guy. And there's incredible conflict around the wild rice right now, which the cottagers see as weeds that are coming up. Their boats and their sea-doos and that kind of thing, but which is actually the staple food in the Kawartha Lakes. It is habitat for a lot of the fish and the birds and the insects. It is incredibly important. What would it be if we decided that serving the earth meant helping to reestablish the crops that were being cultivated so carefully by indigenous peoples before contact? And even more recently than that, some of the more recent treaties are the things that, and the Trent Severn waterway, of course, that destroyed these crops. I'm going to say one more thing and then I'll stop. Let me say something brief about the Noah story, because I think our sanitized Sunday school version of that story often misses the point. The Noah story is about a creational catastrophe, right? And it begins with God's grief, God grieving over the violence that humanity has inflicted on the earth. That's what the text says. And interestingly enough, when the Hebrew text was translated into Greek in the first century, the Greek translators took that word grief and turned it into anger. So in the Greek version of the Old Testament, it actually says God was angry about the violence, because somehow in the Greek mindset, anger was more appropriate of an emotion for God. Maybe they didn't even think anger was an emotion. Rational people get angry, right? Apparently. But grief was considered too too much of an emotion that was inappropriate for God. So they took that out. But the text says God was grieved over the violence on the earth, and God decided to start again. And what Noah ends up doing, Noah, who's a man of the earth, a farmer, is creating this place of biodiversity on the ark, but also apprenticing himself to the service of those animals. The whole time he was in the ark, he was actually learning what it is to serve and observe creation, all these other creatures. I think that's an important part of the story too. How can we apprentice ourselves to creation, to learn what it is to serve the animals and the plants? I'm not going to say too much about tricksters because I haven't thought about them much, but they're all over the biblical story. I mean, there's the serpent and a lot of people who are tricksters, Jacob and Joseph, Rahab, the prostitute who takes in the spies and tricks the soldiers. Ruth could be thought of as a trickster. So they happen throughout the story. And Cynthia, you've just kind of blown open this whole area that I'm now going to be spending a bunch of time exploring. So, and I've been trying to get my head around it ever since you were going to talk about tricksters. And it wasn't until this morning that I suddenly thought, okay, now I think I'm getting it. So, so thanks for that. And I'll just stop there.
Thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. I think we're going to need this 5-minute bio break to get our thoughts in order, because there's so much that you two have offered that require some pondering. So let's take 5 minutes. It's 10:27, so let's make it 7 minutes. So at 10:35, we will start again. So you can pour yourself some coffee, go to the bathroom, whatever, and we'll see you back shortly.
Was my sound quality okay, Amber?
Yes, it was great.
Okay.
Mhm.
I wasn't breaking up and
There were a few points, but it wasn't distracting. Like, at least it wasn't distracting for me. There were just a few, like it would kind of
okay.
slow a little bit, but I think it was great.
Okay, because I turned everything off, but being in the boonies, always have trouble. Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Are we the only two people on here?
It might be.
What you eating?
Strawberries and blueberries in some whipped cream.
Oh, is that in season?
But they're frozen. They're frozen, and they're Ontario wild blueberries, frozen. Because that was in season. Strawberries probably not in season. And I did use maple syrup instead of sugar in my whipped cream. So technically, this isn't an unhealthy thing to be eating at this time of day.
I'm glad to hear that.
I try to make you proud, Mom. So I also knew you would ask me what I was eating. As I was about to put the icing sugar in, I knew that you were going to ask me, so then I switched to the maple syrup.
Icing sugar.
It makes the whipped cream taste so.
For things like, I'm trying to think of some of the things, ginseng, for instance, because we grows wild on Georgina. There's a decoy plant that grows amongst or beside of it or very close to it. And it looks almost the same, except for the leaf shape is a little bit different. And that's because they say, because if your mind is not in the right space, if you're not being respectful and being like preserving, so what you're taught to do is when you pick a ginseng, you pick the berries off the ginseng that you picked and you drop them back into where you picked the ginseng so that it can regrow. If you're not doing any of those things, you can't find it. Like it will hide itself from you, and you won't be able to locate it until you're actually in the right space. And whether that's sweetgrass, ginseng, some of anything around there that's growing as a medicine, you won't find it unless you're in the right place. So this year we had so many puffballs, everybody was marveling. I had like 5 puffballs. It's puffball year, but it's a delicacy on the island. So everybody, I put it on Facebook and women arrived at my door within minutes. I'll take one.
I think I might do that myself.
Yeah.
We had so many puffballs that I was overwhelmed. So everybody who showed up, take a puffball.
If they know what to do with it, right? Although they were saying this morning on the radio, CBC was on, and they were saying, I know we've encouraged people to go out and pick mushrooms, but now we've decided that you should not go pick mushrooms unless you absolutely know that what you're picking is safe to eat. Few cases of poison mushrooms.
Okay, we are back. And so I think what we had wanted to do is already happening, but just to kind of formalize it, Cynthia, if you had further thoughts that you wanted to express, after what Sylvia had to say, before we turn to the rest of the participants for questions and comments.
I just wanted to acknowledge that her words and how clearly she was able to show the connections, that there are all of these similarities, and really it's there in the creation stories, it's there in the trickster tales, it's there in the biblical stories as well, that we have a responsibility, and if we reduce what we do to the facts that we are living on a planet that is finite, we're not going next door anywhere else, we're here, and there are things that we've been doing as humanity that have created put our own selves in danger along with everything else, and we could actually stop that. Like we could do a better job of actually preserving and protecting, but we all have to be a part of that conversation, and we all have to understand that those are actually the instructions that we've been given. When it said go forth and be multiply and be fruitful, it didn't mean run everything over and trample it all into the dust. It meant that you live on the planet in a good way. And I think that that's one of the things that's really interesting to me about indigenous peoples. And there are about 350 million indigenous peoples globally in about 90 countries, and they have the same kinds of admonitions. Like they're saying, take it easy. Don't cut down everything and burn everything and pick everything and beat everything up. That there's a reason why we have this biodiversity, and it's important. And you can read stories about when they put wolves back into major parks, that it reconstitutes the entire ecosystem, because they take down the deer who are eating all, so there's everything is connected. And I think that's one of the things that indigenous peoples have repeatedly said, to everybody is we're all connected. You know, there's nothing that isn't connected to something else. And you know, even in economics, you know, even in capitalism, we're all connected. It doesn't matter what we're doing, we're connected to something else, an action, reaction. And if we're not mindful of that, then we end up with the kinds of situations that we're living with now. And you know, can we stop those fires from occurring in places where so much of the earth has been damaged and can't contain it? I don't know. Can we? I hope we can, because if we don't, all of those prophecies that people talked about the end, you know, and that crossroads where we're now at this place where, you know, we go back to the land and we understand that we have an obligation and a responsibility to it, or we go into AI and purely technological, you know, living, then that's, you know, a lot of our elders say that's a sure path to destruction and death. And it, you know, so we have to think that those 7 generations I was talking about, 7 generations back, you know, we look back so that we can go forward in a good way. Those are what we call wise practices. You know, that there was a reason that people survived through the things that they did. What did they do? And can we still do those kinds of things today? And then 7 generations into the future, what are we sending forward? What are we sending? Where are we sending our children? And what will they have? And you can see the kids of today being very angry with us, or grieving, if that's a better term. You know, grieving the losses that they're seeing, and understanding are coming, and angry in the sense that, you know, blaming those generations before them and saying, you know, can you guys get with this, because we all got to be a part of this conversation. So you know, it's nice to be able to. I've never doubted that the story of Genesis is any different than the creation stories that I've been taught or learned over the course of years. I've never doubted that the message is the same. And that's probably one of the reasons why I've been able to be fairly resilient and hopeful about living, because I see that even in spite of many of the atrocities that we managed to commit on each other. I don't know how many of you have been to the Museum of Human, what's it called in Winnipeg? Human Rights, yeah. And I think I get to the 5th floor, and from the 5th floor up, I just cry. Because it's so hard to be able to understand how, with all of the beauty that we have and all of the possibility that we have, that we can do the kinds of things that we do. And that we're in imminent danger of doing it again. Because we can't just say, oh, well, we're educated now, we're sophisticated now, we're not more knowledgeable now. We still have deep in, you know, racism and division and stratification and classism. You know, we still have those things, and in many places they're ruling. They're not going away. They're getting more intense. And so our messaging, our lessons learned have to be, I think they have to be spoken very, very loudly. Like, we have to keep talking. And even when it doesn't make us very popular, we have to speak up, because it's so important.
Thank you very much. Okay, if it's time to hear from the rest of you for questions and comments, and so I'm encouraging now for you to type things in the chat. I mean, it's not impossible that you can certainly ask to be unmuted if it's easier, but while you're thinking and doing that, I just start off perhaps with a question, a reflection to Cynthia. I found the prophecies that you made reference to from indigenous elders from the past, and not in the distant past, and in the not so distant past, and yet I found them really powerful. That these indigenous peoples who, you know, the colonial enterprise tried very hard to destroy the indigenous culture and worldview, and indigenous peoples physically as well. And yet these prophecies are so obviously coming to pass, that the wisdom of indigenous peoples that was prophesied would come into place and save the world is actually happening. And I just would love your response to that, or what you've heard, maybe you've heard other indigenous people say in the face of these prophecies, that as peoples, it was not possible to wipe you out. And now you are coming back, and I'm going to be a little teary here, coming back lovingly to teach us.
Yeah. Well, you know, I mean, the Bible has lots of prophecy as well. I mean, I don't think it's unusual that we, you know, I mean, I guess it comes down to, you know, who are we really? You know, I mean, you know, that whole question of spirit, of you know, that God is within us, with the Creator is within us, however you want to look at it. Yes, you will, because the belief system is very much about, you know, and Sylvia mentioned a being of service. And you're absolutely right. I mean, I've sent people to powwows and to sweats that are non-Indigenous who have come back to me and said, I don't think I could be that forgiving. I mean, I'm so, you know, I know what happened. I know about residential schools. I know about colonialism. I know about, you know, the destruction that has been experienced across Canada and the United States, and of course in the Southern Hemisphere. I know, and yet when I go into a place of Indigenous peoples, I'm welcomed in. And they take me and they feed me and they teach me and they, I mean, some of the things that we're doing now is with child welfare, where kids are being taken away from our communities in huge numbers, rather than a group in BC decided that rather than lose a second child to a family because she had to go, there's two sisters, they just adopted the whole family. And now that family, non-Indigenous family, is part of their nation, rather than saying, okay, we'll just take this. So there's a different kind of a philosophy behind all that in terms of who we are and how we relate to each other. The prophecies are quite clear about that. And that is a very clear prophecy that I've known for many, many, many years, is that there will come a time when people will need to return to the land, to those teachings, and that we would be the ones that they would come to. And the problem I've always had with that is, okay, then we better be ready. And, you know, with all the things that have happened to our people and all of the hurt and the trauma and the, you know, the addictions and all of the violence, you know, that we have to work. I mean, I guess we feel such a sense of urgency around, you know, who's going to be responsible for that. But when you look at, again, those fires, you know, the first fire, the second, you know, now we're in the 7th or 8th fire. And those are the ones that say, your kids will come to us, our kids, and they will learn. And we'll be able to do this. But can we, or will we burn the planet? Right? So, you know, the message is very clear. Yes, we can do this, but we need to do it together. It's not going to be just the Indigenous people who are going to survive and are going to save everything. It's going to be everybody. And how are we going to do that? Because we now have 8 billion people on the planet, all struggling. And it's going to get more intense, because as we have the oceans rising and land masses disappearing or being drowned, we'll have environmental refugees. We'll have people moving about the planet that have never moved about the planet before, and they have to come somewhere. And Canada is probably as likely a place as any place. So are we going to be able to open our gates? And are we going to be able to, you know, to endorse that Indigenous worldview, which says we're all in this together? That we have responsibility to each other. So it's, I mean, we've managed to be able to do that. And some people have closed their gates, it's true. But I think generally speaking, the Indigenous population is of the opinion that we have to be of service, and we have to help each other.
Okay, we have a lot of really good questions coming in. I think I'm going to turn it to Virginia, who had sent me a question. Would you like to ask your question, Virginia?
Mute.
There you go.
Okay, I'm good. Okay, so I was wondering, this is the question to both Sylvia and Cynthia. How would you compare the Old Testament prophets to the prophets of the Indigenous people? it seemed almost like the indigenous prophets were of the future telling, whereas the prophets of the Old Testament are of the warning of today. But I think that there's a lot more nuance there. So how would you compare the two of them?
Go ahead, Sylvia.
I could start for a second. I think it's kind of a while there was in the Old Testament prophets certainly a sense of warning in terms of present actions. I think there was also, you get these kind of visions of what will happen when harmony is restored and when all things are set to right, right? When God will come again and bring renewal. And interestingly enough, I was struck by the visions that Cynthia was talking about, the prophecies that Cynthia was talking about, and some of these Old Testament prophecies. I mean, a lot of them have all the nations coming together to learn together. In that case, it would be coming to Israel, but all the nations would bring their gifts to Israel so that they could all live together in peace and safety. And always the prophecies of restoration in the Hebrew prophets, without exception, always include a restoration of creation. Creation is always renewed, which is kind of stunning. So I think there actually are parallels to the prophecies that the Great Fire prophecies and others that Cynthia was talking about. And I wonder if, I mean, part of this is all coming out of a place of, the prophets are the wise people in the tradition, right? They're good at discerning what's gone wrong, and they're very wise about needing to know what it's going to take in order for renewal to come and healing to come. And in all of these traditions, that renewal and healing in the end can only come if humanity learns to live in balance and in harmony, both with creation and one another again.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's true. When I was living in the remote community in Canada, when I was doing my doctoral work, one of the things they did was they studied the Old Testament. And so we spent, I don't know, several weeks, every week reading another portion of that. And the interesting thing to me was, and they're very Christian, they were very Anglican, they weren't studying anything about indigenous prophecy or anything like that. But it was interesting to me how many parallels were raised around what they were saying and what I understood, and even the use of the four, of the number four times this and four times that, and and then seven, and how many seven, this and seven of that. And it's like, it's so interesting because, so I always wondered, is it because, our prophets and our wisdom keepers were influenced by Christianity, or is it because we're just humans and, we're all human beings. We all are a creation of the Creator, and we all have similar understanding deep within us. That that we just all espouse some of the similar kinds of understandings. We've all experienced the flooding of the earth, or the taking down of the earth and the rebuilding experience. It just makes sense to me that we're all human beings, and we're all in this together. And so those stories, those prophecies of people coming or going are very similar. And of course things would happen in Israel because that's where the Bible was written, and they understood, that's what they knew. They didn't have access to this other continent, and we didn't have access to that continent. And yet our stories have a lot of very interesting similarities. So I think it's just about, it's like I tell people, when you look at the movies, the media that is being presented to you today, where's that coming from? It comes out of out of us as human beings, and those ideas and those predictions and those thoughts of what's going to happen. And so you see an increase in survival stories, survival movies being presented, so because we're all thinking sort of collectively about the same things, and we're influenced on our unconscious levels by that. I think the 100 Monkeys story, I think it's called 100 Monkeys, is the one that always stuck in my mind from school. Was on one of the island, I can't remember anymore what the island was, but one of the female, of course it was a female monkeys, they used to feed them mangoes, and they would just drop them on the beach, and the monkeys would go pick them up off the beach and eat them. Well, one time, one young female took her mango and she went over to the ocean and she rinsed it off so that there was no more sand on it, and she ate it. And pretty soon all the other monkeys were picking up their mangoes and going to the water and rinsing them off and eating them without the sand. Okay, that's great. That's learning. But the most interesting thing about that was other islands, as much as 10 miles away, began to do the same thing. Huh. So that influence in the unconscious, right, is there. And you see that happen quite often with discoveries. Somebody discovers something important medically, and almost simultaneously, France and Italy and the United States, and, they're all at the very same time, or very close to the same time, make the same discovery. So again, there's this well of hope. One of the ways I've had experience of that myself was when I was about 38 years old. I was at a I guess you'd call it a spa, and I was one part of my spa package was to have a session with the resident psychologist, or whatever. I think it was psychologist. And so I thought, well, I've never been to a psychologist before. I mean, like that. So I thought I would go. And when I went into the room, it was a white man. He sat, and he didn't ask me my name, other than my first name. He didn't ask me where I was from. He didn't ask me anything about myself or my background, nothing. He just said, okay, have a seat in the chair. And then he said, I'm going to regress you. And I thought, okay, never had that happen. Do I have to take my clothes off? He's like, no. And then he said, no, we're going to walk down the street. You close your eyes. We're going to walk. He had this music going, and he said, okay, so we're going to walk down the street. And I'm thinking, as an Indigenous kid raised by residential school survivors with a lot of violence and stuff, we moved regularly. So I'm thinking, okay, what street, right? I find a street. Okay, now we're going to go into your house, the little white picket fence. I'm thinking, not in my neighborhood. So, and then into the, and he says, okay, I'm going to, there's a closet there. You're going to get in the closet, and I'm going to walk you down. I'm going to talk you down. So, you're okay, 35, 32, 28, and so we're going down. And then he says, and when I stop counting, the door is going to open and you're going to tell me what you see. So we go down, and the doors open, and in front of me is this image, and I immediately burst into tears. I just started to cry hard, snot, everything, like not nice, like just, woo! And he's like, oh my God, get back in the elevator. And I'm like crying, and he's like, get back in. And finally gets me back in, and he counts me back up to the main thing. And then he says, okay, that was your session. It's, 50 minutes. See you later. And I'm like, okay, see you, thank you. And now I'm crying for 4 months. Okay, I'm shopping, I'm crying. I'm looking after my kids, I'm crying. I'm walking down the street, I'm crying. I finally go to a real psychologist and say, look, you got to help me here, right? And so I had to go through some therapy to resolve that. But what I saw, the point of it all is what I saw when those gates open, when the door opened, was this massive ocean of grief. Mm. And I remember thinking, there's no way in heaven that I will be able to heal that. I can't do it. And I just started to weep, because it just hit me so hard in the chest and in the heart. And so, but really ultimately what it came to was I realized that wasn't my grief. That wasn't my grief. That was a grief of nations. That was grief of, I don't know, everybody. And the thought that I would be able to heal that was an impossibility. But once I realized it was a collective grief, it was easier for me to move on. But at the moment, So sometimes we get a glimpse of what it means to be human and what it means to be a spiritual being. And it can be terrifying. But it's so important that we do that so that we actually have an ability to find equilibrium, to come back to balance, to have, to have that peace. From those experiences, they have been very helpful to me in my lifetime. So, because I don't worry about those things now. I understand that that's a normal thing. Prophecy, the ways we see the world, the hurt that we're experiencing, that we have an opportunity here. It's that crisis opportunity thing, right? You can see it through two different kinds of lenses. You can see it as, oh, the end is nigh, or you can say, hey, we need to step up and do something about this. There's lots of ways to approach it. Yeah, go ahead, Sylvia.
Could I add one thing to that? Because this is a great question, and thank you, Cynthia. That was the vision of grief is something I've been wrestling with lately. There are two places in the prophets, the Old Testament prophets, that actually suggest that God has stories with other peoples that the Hebrew scriptures know nothing about. And the prophet alludes to them. So in Amos chapter 9, God says, didn't I bring, Israel up from Egypt? That's Exodus, the big story. But the Philistines from Caphtor and the Arameans from Ker, like, I have other stories of liberation with other peoples that you know nothing about. And Isaiah 19 has a similar kind of reference that suggests God has these other stories. And Randy Woodley, who I referred to before, who is Kitoa, and talks about how the indigenous creation stories he grew up with are his Old Testament as a Christian indigenous man. And of course, we know that the history of Israel is a culturally conditioned story. It's a story of one people. But if Creator is truly God of the whole earth, then of course there are stories and prophecies that Creator has with those peoples elsewhere on the earth. And I think we need to, there's even for people who want to think about Christianity as very, very exclusive. No, this text talks about those other stories. And that's really, really important in terms of not having a sense that we have the only true story.
Exactly. Yes, that was the truth. There's many truths. We don't have the only truth. There are many truths. I was just looking at some of the chat things and just picking up words there. Somebody, the whole question of multiverse, and why do I use that term? Again, that's part of the whole thing about this exclusivity that we have everything, that there's more than one universe. We talk about a universe as if there's nothing else other than us. But if you read Leroy Littlebear's work, and those of you that are looking out for, Leroy Littlebear is one of our indigenous philosophers. He's a professor emeritus at Lethbridge University, and I think he's still an advisor to the president there. But he writes as a scientist. And the other scientist, that indigenous philosopher scientist, is Gregory COYOTE, CAJETE or something like that. So, and they talk about, there's this expansive view of the world and of the universe, so that there's multiverse, there's many things going on. And even the multidimensional speaking or thinking, that it's, getting on this one path that people quite frequently do is not helpful to you. It's like it's being a little bit closed-minded when you can open that up into a much more expansive place, and that's wisdom. When there's many trails of information and knowledge coming at and through you. It's not just one thing. I know one thing, that I'm on top. No, there's many things that you can think about in terms of where your positioning is in the in this thing called life and creation. So I think that that's really important. But those are two people, I think, if you want to do a little bit extra reading, those are the places that you could go to. And yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say that I think Brian also has a question that's really relevant to what's been discussed right now. So Brian, I don't know if you would like to ask your question.
Sure. Yeah. So my question really comes back to story and the way that we live with and within and through stories. So sort of two-part question. Is part of reconciliation learning to live in multiple stories? And how as settlers can we live in, draw on, and share indigenous stories?
I mean, I think Sylvia should also be able to speak to this part of reconciliation, living in multiple stories. Yeah, we all live in multiple stories every day. I think we have stories that we're creating on an ongoing basis, and stories that are informing every action that we take. So, I mean, I think it's what's his name, King, says all we are is stories. So yes, we can live in multiple stories, and your multiple stories might engage your entire family, you know, in terms of how you express yourself on a day-by-day basis and where you're living. Yes, there's lots of stories going on. How to live in those stories from an indigenous perspective and share stories. I think that, you know, one of the things that elders tell us about stories and telling stories is that you need to live those stories. So the only stories you really can tell is the story that is yours. Let me give you an example. In some communities, at least prior to, you know, this sort of colonization piece, a story of a community belonged to the entire community. So everybody held a piece of the story. So when we all came together, so everybody in this space held one section of the story. And to really be able to tell the story, we all had to be present. And I shared my part of it, and then Sylvia shared hers, and then Brian shared his, and Virginia shared hers, and Amber shared hers, and Karen shared hers. And that created community. If anybody was missing or pushed away, what would happen to the story? So you can see how Indigenous people's story became fragmented as colonialism broke people away and put them in jail and stole their children into residential schools. And, you know, so there's this fragmented story where pieces that should be in the circle are no longer there. So we don't have a cohesive story to tell, right? And you can't tell the story of a residential school person because it's not you, but you can tell the story of residential schools from the perspective that you've understand it and have learned it. You know, you can't ignore it, right? It's there. So it's part of Canada's story. Indian residential schools are part of Canada's story, but it's like the Me Too movement that's going on across the country. I had a friend of mine call me who's also Indigenous and say, well, we need to do something about this, and we need to tell the stories of some of these women who have been subjected to abuse as well. And I said, you know what, you can't do it. You cannot go and tell another woman's story. She has to tell that story because it's her story, not yours. You can tell the story of Me Too and the role you may play in it, but you can't tell another woman's story about her experience because it's her experience. See the difference? So you're kind of, you know, so there's that. You didn't live in residential schools, and I didn't live in residential schools, but my parents lived in residential schools, and I can reference their story, but I couldn't tell my mother's story in the completeness that she could because she lived and experienced it. But I can't ignore it either.
I think, you know, Cynthia's point that we all live in multiple stories, I think we tend to forget that. We tend to think if we're, say, Christian, that we live out of the Christian story, say. But, you know, the dominant story that shapes our culture is the story of capitalism, quite frankly. That's the story we live out of most commonly and make our decisions out of. The story of globalization, you know, to use an older term, you know, the story of the military industrial complex shapes everything that we do. And you know, the stories our politicians tell us. All of these, we already are living within a lot of different stories. The question is, which stories do we want to live out of? Which stories do we want to say, this is the story that is going to shape my actions and my worldview and the priorities that I want to have? Which story will we give power to? And I think what's happened in our culture is we've given certain economic stories a lot of power. and allowed them to have a lot of power over us. And we need to say no more. We want to ground ourselves in these other kind of stories. We want to say, you know, does the story of Sky Woman have something to teach us about who we are as human beings and who Creator is? That's fundamentally different than the story that shapes the dominant narrative in the paper and on the internet. And well, I won't go further down that path because it'll get us into stories I don't want to talk about. But the other thing about being a settler and trying to access these stories, hear the stories, it's a really hard one because we've put a lot of pressure on Indigenous peoples to say, you know, Cynthia does a lot of this, and there's a lot of people now who say, I want to hear the voices of Indigenous people, and there's I guess there's just not that many points of contact for many of us. This is how we start to realize that we really have segregated our society, right? That for a lot of people, there aren't natural, you know, if you want to hear the story of somebody from Syria, it's really quite easy. You can find somebody in your community from Syria who's willing to story. But it's harder for, especially where I live in rural Ontario in the Kawartha Lakes. And, you know, I know people who have never met anybody Indigenous, which is stunning to me because I grew up actually in Caledonia. My uncle married somebody from Six Nations. I have cousins who are Mohawk. So for me, that's a weird idea, but that makes it harder to hear stories. And I think that doing something like finding the reading list that Cynthia is going to give us and just do some of that work yourself, start some of the hard work of reading stories and then finding out what's happening in your area. I know in Toronto, Pam Thompson, who's still, oh, there she is, there's Pam, every week publishes a digest, the weekly Indigenous News Digest, that tells you what's going on in Southern Ontario so that you can tap in to what Indigenous organizations and groups are doing. And you can go listen and hear what some of those stories are. And a lot of that is storytelling. There's a lot of stuff online as well now of varying quality. That's always your challenge. And just to refer to what Cynthia said in terms of telling our own story, I think it's also to hear settler stories about interactions with Indigenous peoples. That's really quite important. So the Mennonite Church in Saskatchewan is talking about discovering that all the farmland they were given was from the Chipewyan, I always say that wrong, people in Saskatchewan, and they're trying to figure out how to make reparation now. And so those settlers are telling the story of injustice from their point of having discovered that story. And that's really important to hear too. And we try to do a little bit of that in our book at Romans Disarmed, which the whole first chapter is about our friend Iggy, who was Indigenous from James Bay and his death in Toronto. And we tell the story of the residential schools in that book but we tell about it as settlers and encourage people to go hear those stories from other people if they can. But it's important, I think, for settlers to acknowledge that history too.
Well, that word you just used is probably one of the most important words is acknowledgement.
Yeah.
And, you know, the idea that when you acknowledge, you can then accept. Whereas if you choose not to acknowledge that these things happened, then we can't get to reconciliation. We can't get to reparation. We can't get to restoration because it's not feasible, or, you know, it didn't happen. Basically, with Plenty Coups said that after that nothing happened. So there's some really important parts of those stories that need to be told, and how you absorb them, and how you then teach them from your own perspective. And yes, I've done this for probably the last almost 40 years now, of just talking and bringing people together and creating a reconciliation process everywhere I can. so that people have an understanding. And many times it's been in a situation where, you know, I'm talking to a group of mostly men, you know, that are M&R workers, and they're just sort of like, you know, okay, convince me. And then having to spend several days just talking to them from perspectives that make some sense to them. Because that's one of the things that I know. It's really hard for you to accept. This is why this today was done the way it is done. Because if only I spoke to you about it, you would be like, oh, that's interesting. I'm not really sure where to put that. But then having Sylvia, you know, bring the other side of that equation together, it gives you perspective from two different angles that actually are speaking about the same thing. And that's really important, because it's all, you know, perspective and perception are very important parts of this conversation. Even when we go back to looking at the whole question of treaty, you know, where you're standing and interpreting is a very important part of what happens with those treaties. Because if you're standing on the side who actually says, well, yeah, we made the treaty, but doesn't really mean anything, or you're standing on the indigenous side who said, we put everything into this and we believed you, you know, where do we go? Like a very good example of that is in Treaty 6, and it's called the Medicine Chest Clause. And the Medicine Chest Clause says that a box of medicines shall be kept at the office of the Indian agent. And you have to go back to that time when that was negotiated and understand that the indigenous peoples did not speak English. So, you know, they're sick. There's a lot of epidemics rolling across the country. Many indigenous people died, as many as 82% in Canada, or 62% in Canada. And they're saying, we need medicines, we need doctors, we need care. Our people are dying. And so it's interpreted, and they use the word of a medicine box because it's, you know, that's their sort of translation of this piece that they need. And so the government interprets that they need a medicine box, which means they need a box of aspirins and Band-Aids and, you know, whatever, to sit in the Indian agent's office. But that's not what they were asking for. If you go back and you look at the record and you look at Morris's letters behind what's actually published in the treaty, you see him saying, you know, they were asking for these other pieces. They wanted doctors, and they wanted healthcare, and they wanted medicine. So interpreting that is a really important part of that. And so we go to law and look at law and how law interprets those. They minimize. I mean, that's what's happening on the east coast of the lobster fishery. You know, you can make I think use the word modest or something like that. You can make a little income. Well, why is it they're held to a little income when everybody else can make, you know, thousands, millions of dollars on it, but yet indigenous peoples are held to a modest income? And there are rules around that it can only be for ceremonial purposes. You can only feed your own family. You know, it can only be used by the community. You can't sell it. You have no commercial ability to be able to survive and make a living. And that's true right across the country. So there's a lot going on in this country continuously and now that speaks to that. And we have a minister of Crown Relations and Reconciliation, Minister Bennett, who has said to me personally, this country robbed me. I up till the time of 10 or 15 years ago, I had no knowledge of indigenous peoples. I had never met an indigenous person. I had no understanding of their ceremonies or their life ways or their stories or anything else. And in the last 10 or 15 years, as a critic and as a, you know, now as a minister who is specifically asked for this portfolio, she has got friends, and she's gone to ceremony, and she's been taught, and she's got teachings, and she's got all that. And she says, it's changed my life. It's changed my life. And she's not the only person that I've met across the country that I've had occasion to work with that have said that to me, that this country robbed them of the opportunity to really truly understand the foundations of the entire place, which is indigenous. The language you use, you know, the cities, the names of, you know, Montreal, Saskatchewan, you know, Toronto, like, even Ontario, you know, they're all indigenous words that have been somewhat anglicized, but they're there. And a lot of the, you know, being world peacekeepers on the world stage is about the foundations of indigeneity that says we have to be in harmony, peaceful, in balance. And yet, you know, we've stepped away from that with the capitalism and the things that Sylvia was just talking about. So there's so many pieces around this conversation that you have been basically shut out of, and not by virtue of the indigenous population, but by virtue of the circumstances in which we live under the legislation, the law, and all the rest of it. So having adopted as a country the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, actually gives us an opportunity as a country to say, yes, we can actually create a process in our country, law and legislation and the rest of it, that actually reflect that Indigenous worldview and bring us restorative practices in our law as opposed to punitive. And you can look right across the country and understand how Indigenous peoples deal with those kinds of issues. It's not punitive, it's restorative. It's recognition that when a wrong is done, it can be righted. And so take that and raise that up to the conversation we're having about, we've made some mistakes, but they can be corrected. And, and then you understand why this conversation is so important.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that. Let's see, Ruth and Peter, you had a question. Let's turn to you.
Oh, on a more practical level, I guess, is there anything we can do collectively coming out of this time together that we could commit to work on? And I'm wondering, is the very basic thing about water, the right to have clean water. I know there's many issues around healthcare and housing as well, but I'm wondering if you could comment on, just expand a little bit more about water.
Yeah, water. So there's a lot of boil water advisories, and my own community actually was in a boil water advisory for the last 12 years. So I understand the concerns around water. And again, it comes back to the same thing that Sylvia was talking about, that whole capitalist notion of who gets to be in charge of the resources and who gets to allocate them in places where they think they should go, and who's worthy and who's not. So, for many instances, reserves were left off that particular equation, and the reserves are said to be in the responsibility of the federal government and not the provincial government, who's often in charge of making those kinds of decisions around water safety and all that stuff. Reserves are like little enclaves in the larger province, because they're federally monitored and financed, I guess would be the other word for it. So one of the things that you can certainly do is you can raise your voices in the context of water, so that when you vote and you go and talk to the people that are in charge of your particular riding or your associations, is that you can say, I want to know before I vote, what are you going to do about safe water? The other piece that's really important here, I think, is the whole piece around children and child welfare. And we've tried very hard to reform the child welfare system that takes our kids away in droves, in huge numbers. My own daughter had a baby in August of this year. She's the director at the University of Ottawa in Indigenous relations, and she is clearly Native. And her, when she raised an issue of complaint against somebody that's walking through the room without a mask, the nurses immediately said to her, if you complain or you try to leave, we'll call CAS on you. Just like that.
Wow. Oh my God.
And she was like, whoa, like, I never said I was doing any of that. I just don't want this guy walking through my room when I got a newborn here without a mask when we're in the middle of a pandemic. So there's issues like that if you learn about them and raise them and say, my vote is going where the care for these and the resolution of these things happens. I think that's important. And you need to hold the people in your ridings to that. Even if, I don't care whether they're conservative, liberal, whatever they are, you need to hold them accountable to that. And that's one way of raising your voices and doing something that's going to make a difference. I remember speaking to the University Women's Association somewhere south of Toronto. Can't remember, because they're all over the country. And they asked me the same thing. This is probably 10 years ago or more. What could we do? And I said, well, what interests do you have? And they talked about different things. And what we settled on was the question of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And I said, you can, rather than only low-hanging fruit, you can actually demand that Canada actually labels its bottles for everybody, because this is not only an Indigenous issue, that say this can harm your fetus, because none of our alcohol bottles do that unless they're leaving the country. There's no warning on it. So rates of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder in Canada are quite high, exceptionally high actually, and not just in our communities, as I've said, in lots of places, because there's no real understanding, because it was only became a diagnosis in 1973. And prior to that, it was quite common for women to still drink or smoke while they were pregnant. So now we've got some changes. So there's things you can do in your own community, in your own church, you know, by inviting speakers in and having them come into a circle and ask questions like this so that we can answer them and make suggestions. You know, putting up a small what would they call it, like a small award to Indigenous students in the local high school. You know, to help them with their books and education. Right now, we're going through a pandemic where we're finding that a lot of children, non-Indigenous as well, do not have access to computers and tablets. They don't have it. And so mothers are concerned now about the inequity in education that they're going to experience through this year when they go back to school. Or what have they missed? And that's Indigenous kids and non-Indigenous kids, Black kids as well. So you can raise resources to create a purchasing power for them so that they can come and they can get a tablet for their kids. And those are pretty local things to do, but it's a start, you know, just by taking an interest is a start.
Good.
Thank you.
Yeah, those are some really helpful, suggestions and helpful thoughts. Jean, I know that you've had a couple questions. You are muted. Oh,
here I am.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that I have been mulling about, and perhaps Sylvia, this is something you might be able to address, with the issue of empire. From my perspective, Christianity has become Second Empire Rome, because Christianity, if you take that mandate of go forth and teach ye all nations, baptizing them, basically Christianity has become a club, a very exclusive, patriarchal club. And I use club in the broadest sense of that word, as an organization of exclusive membership and rights, plus the actual weapon, which is, I think, what has gotten us to where we are today. Now, that mandate should never have been in my estimation, in anything that we call a Bible, because I don't think we have a right to bring anyone into our particular club. In fact, I don't think the club should exist at all. And that is, and the perfect illustration of this is the closing scene, or I'm sorry, the next to closing scene in The Godfather 1. And Francis Ford Coppola captured this perfectly, because he has the scene of baptism juxtaposed with a scene of some pretty horrific violence. And that to me sums up Christianity, because we have the words of baptism and initiation into a club where we say that rite is what brings the Holy Spirit in. And then we have the justification of violence. And to me, we have a great deal to acknowledge that Christianity should not be a club, either as a weapon or as an exclusive, top of the rung organization, as if we were some exclusive golf club. And, you know, again, I'll just say the word Trump, but that symbolizes what I believe Christianity has become. And so you've got capitalism and also fueled by patriarchy, and Christianity fueled by patriarchy. And what we have ended up with is a club, which is essentially, because, and I love the way Christians point the finger at the Romans. And as an Italian, I take great umbrage at that, because Christianity became what it beheld. So, Sylvia, from your perspective, what do you think?
Well, let's just open up Pandora's box here, Jean. No, I mean, you're absolutely right. And I think a huge part of the problem is that verse, became kind of the touchstone for creating a church structure, a hierarchy, to which then people had to assent to certain things so that they would belong. And of course, this is an event sponsored by an Anglican church, which is an Episcopal structure, which is modeled on the Roman Empire in a lot of ways, right? So we're the worst at this in some ways in terms of our structures. I mean, when Jesus says, "Go and make disciples," I mean, the word disciple just means go and make people who are going to follow in this way, right? And that way is, I mean, if you kind of look at the context of the whole biblical story, this is what drives me nuts about how people read the Bible, is often it's just a verse here and a verse there, and we put our own cultural constructs on that verse then, right? And then it all gets interpreted in that way. I mean, in the biblical story, God's plan was not to have all these great relationships with individual believers. That's not what the Bible is about. It's about creating a community of justice, a community where the vulnerable will be the most cared for. I mean, that's what the Old Testament laws were about. There's all these laws about, here's how you treat the people who are blind in your community, people who might fall off a roof, I mean, there's laws about, accessibility in the Old Testament Torah and about justice. And so it's all about this kind of community where God can dwell, and where this vision that God has for a world in harmony, where all creatures are at home, can come to full expression. Jesus comes later in the story, because the people really aren't getting it, to sort of say, let me just show it to you. Let me show it to you what it's going to look like. I'm going to gather people around me who are the most motley assortment of people that you could ever imagine, that nobody else wants to hang out with. And I'm going to hang out with them and show you that this is what the kingdom looks like. And it is this sort of welcome and it is justice. I mean, you've got stories where people give their money away, and Jesus keeps telling people to give their money away. It's all about shaping a certain kind of community. That's what's supposed to happen. And so that go and make disciples isn't, go and make sure people believe certain things, and then you can welcome them in. But Jesus is saying, you know what? Let people walk through those waters of baptism to become part of this great community, because they symbolize that anybody can start over again and become part of this, this wonderful story that we're trying to live out here. Where all of creation is forgiven and healed and restored. That's what that verse refers to. The church, of course, has taken it to, in its classic emphasis on individualism, to refer to people who are going to be either in or going to be out. Yeah. And it has become that exclusive club. And you're absolutely right. Christianity has not only put its seal upon empire, but it has acted as empire. I mean, it's striking that if you read the beginning of the book of Daniel, these young men are taken to Babylon, and the king decides that these young men will be given new names, will be taught a new language and the stories and literature of the Babylonians, and will be given different food. They can't eat the food that connects them to the land they came from. Does that sound familiar to you? Exactly. That's what happened in residential schools, right? Yeah. And who administered the residential schools? We did. The churches. I mean, I don't think we need any other evidence that the churches has been, glove in hand, how do you shake your own hand, with empire. And it's, that's the truth about what the church has done. So that's our challenge. How do we repent of that? I mean, this is why the churches, I think, need to be at the forefront in thinking through what reconciliation looks like, what reparations will be, right? We've done as Anglicans some monetary reparations, but that's not enough. That's a little step. That's easy. How can we commit to more monetary reparations, but also, the structural reparations that need to happen. That's a whole conversation we need to have. And now your question also taps into deeper questions, Jean, about the structure of the church, which I won't get into here, but that would be a very interesting conversation, because though I attend an Anglican church and am part of the bishop's committee, I think the structure is completely screwed up and nothing like what Jesus especially had envisaged. But that's a whole other story. So, and I know that a lot of you agree with that too.
Yeah, some of the churches are actually looking at how to get out of those conversations, to change those conversations as well. And there is a move, I think, maybe led by the United Church, but just the idea of creating a covenant that basically says, we refute the doctrine of discovery. We accept that there were these agreements, these treaties that were made, and we want to uphold them, and we want to create those reparations, and we want to be able to ensure that our membership across the country, our communities of worship understand this and are a part of this conversation. So that covenant is in process of being made, and will be probably launched, because this December is the 5th anniversary of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action being tabled. And the question is, what have we been able to achieve in the last 5 years as a country, and as individuals, I suppose, in some ways? What have we done to be able to address it in child welfare, and in education, and in law, and in in business, and in capitalism, and in in all the areas that it speaks to? I think there's something like 36 general calls to action for basically everybody, libraries, and you name it. So there's a lot that's going on. The Catholic Church is not necessarily part of that particular conversation, but part of it is also about the structure, or the different structure of the Catholic Church, which is not it's not quite the same. And when and as you were talking, I was thinking about how years ago I was looking at some of the structures within the indigenous community, and the influences of the church and that empire thing on those structures, and how it is there. You see the hierarchical structures being developed and made, partly to accommodate, I guess, organization, right? So we have there's somebody here, and there's these people are responsible for that. But it shows up everywhere, because it's the nature of who we are. That's just who we are as human beings. We want to stratify. If we all had the same exact house, we'd try to plant different flowers. And my flowers would be better than your flowers. It's just who we are. And lots of religions have the same thing, right? They're closed gates. You just can't waltz in and say, I want to be a member. You have to have meet certain criteria to be a part of the club, if you want to call it that. But I think that's true. And then the indigenous communities also have things like that. They have medicine societies that, you just don't get to be a member of. There's a process that takes you into that membership, and it's quite private, actually. It's not something that I've ever had any desire to be a part of, but I'm not a practitioner, which is also really important, right? Some people, not every one of you, if you go to church, is going to be administering. You're not going to be talking, and you're not going to be on the pulpit. You're going to be attending. And a lot of our people are like that. We're not all medicine people. We're not all in the position to be able to sit, to do ceremony, for instance. Those are held for very special training and time spent, right? And I remember asking one of the medicine guys that I worked with for many years, what it would take for me to learn what he knew how long would it take him to impart to me so that I could articulate it like he did? And he said, about 10 years of daily training. And I said, Jesus, that's another PhD, forget it. I don't want to do that. I don't have the time for that. But we all pick our pathways, right? And some people actually dedicate that time and that effort to becoming that knowledgeable about those things. And for me, it was like, no. I mean, and who was the guy? There was another guy that wrote, can't think of his name, Vine Deloria. If you look up Vine Deloria, it just like it sounds, Biedloria. Vine Deloria Jr. wrote something like 28 books about spiritual practice and about ceremony, but he was not a practitioner. He was an academic more than anything. But, participating and observing and learning and being a part of this communities meant that he was, the book that he wrote, and it was published posthumously, was The Way We Once Were, or something like that. I think it's called The Way We Once Lived or something. But essentially what he did is he went across the entire country and spoke to practitioners. He spoke to ceremonial leaders. He spoke to medicine people, and he wrote down their stories. The Hopi, how they could raise a stalk of corn right practically out of the ground in front of you, and stories that had been written down by settlers and people that were arriving into their territories. And when people still had that power before the story got so fragmented that the power was reduced. And it's a great it's a great place for you to look at. I've given that book to some of my own community members who hardly read at all and read the thing from cover to cover. They were so fascinated by it. So, there are things like that, but we have probably fewer practitioners like you do. We probably have fewer practitioners of ceremony and teachings than we once did. Fewer people attend church today, probably than ever historically. So, we're all kind of losing the sacred and moving into the secular. And for me, my understanding is that there's such a thing as a spiritual web. There's a spiritual web that holds us. And at one time, many more people were praying for everybody else. There were more monks and more, spiritual people around the world praying and being immersed in spiritual practice than there are today. And I think we see the results of that. We see a world breaking up and fragmenting because we don't have that holding us anymore. Those foundations are important. And that whole kind of turning away from spirit, turning away from the sacred, turning away from praying before we eat our food, turning away from attending ceremony or church or whatever it might be that keeps you awake. Because one of the things we tell our young people is ceremony focuses you. It brings you into the now and holds you there. So we don't do that anymore. So our kids are running around all over the place, taking drugs to, and trying to escape their grief and their hurts when instead of turning to the elders in the places where they would find that solace. So, we're experiencing similar kinds of impacts from the world in which we live in today. The stories that we're telling each other, the stories that we're making, right? The stories that we're living into. So it's a very important time for us, for all of us.
Can I just say, I'm just to quickly interrupt the questions to say that Cynthia has given us this very extensive reading list, and I'll make sure that it gets sent out to all of you
Beautiful.
in the next day or so.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if I'd sent it or I was just thinking about it. Good. And I just want to say about that reading list, I have read all of those books. And so I know that they're eminently readable. But if you want to look at some specific stories, Stolen Life by Yvonne Johnson's life. She's a real person. She's now out of prison, but she's a real person who experienced some pretty tragic beginnings. And I read that book. It's quite thick. I read it. I stayed up all night long and read it all night long until I finished it. It was that absorbing for me. There's books there about the treaties. There's books there about some of the experiences that Indigenous people had through residential schools. There's also books there that talk about all of us and how we are deeply affected by the hurts that we've experienced in our lives, how adverse childhood experiences and intensely stressful circumstances affect the rest of our lives and affect the story that we're living. And maybe it wasn't our life, maybe it was our mother's life or our grandmother's life. But until we confront and deal with and resolve, we're going to live that story to a certain extent. And it talks about how those traumas affect how we see ourselves and how we, and the lens we look at other people through. So there's books that address a lot of those different kinds of questions. And there's books there on Indian hospitals, which are very rarely talked about. The residential schools are talked about quite a lot, but the fact that the federal government also opened Indian hospitals where Indigenous peoples were put through experimental drugs and experiences and were tested on before they were given to the general population. One school was open hospital was open specifically for that reason, and 33 kids were actually held in that school, all of whom, maybe there's only about 2 people left alive who have died of brain cancers and all kinds of other cancers in their bodies because of all of the things they were injected with that were tested on them. And I have an aunt who is still alive, she's 82 now, who was put in a tubercular institute when she was a child, and again, experimentally drugged on a number of different things and never was able to have children because of it. And she's not the only one. So lots of things that have happened that are really not necessarily talked about and have been buried under all kinds of things. And you should also know this, by the way, so that reminds me, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission took 7,000 testimonial stories from people across Canada. During the same period of time, the independent adjudication process took another 7,000 or 8,000 stories. The records for the IAP process are slated to be destroyed. Canada has won a court case and they are going to destroy those records. Really, some of them by the end of this year or by January at the latest to 2021, and the rest within 15 years. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's records, which were public records, are held at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. And most of them are safe. But what you need to know is Canada has won a case against the survivors to have those records retained into the future, partly because they name names and families who were, men didn't come home from residential school and say, oh, I raped 3 children today. They just didn't do that. But the children who are now adults know their names, remembered their names, and they name them in those records, and they say, and so in some of those records, there would be a name, and then there would be a number beside the name, 3, 25, 36. And that number is how many times the same perpetrator was named by these now adults from their childhood experience. So they want the records destroyed. And student on student abuses, some of our leadership, Indigenous leadership across Canada, are named as well on the student on student abuses. And they don't want their names out there either because they don't want their families to know. So rather than redacting the records or just blocking them for 50 years, they're going to be destroyed. Now, the problem with that is, 100 years from now, if we have all managed to get ourselves together and not burn up the planet, people are going to say, what are you talking about? Where's the evidence? That didn't happen. And we're not going to have any ability to show any evidence of what happened in the stories that those people told at great cost to themselves, I might add. Many of those people who had managed to shove down many of the atrocities that were committed against them had to bring them all up and even in some instances act them out to be able to be compensated. And they used a grid pattern. If you were raped once, if you were raped 5 times, or you were raped 50 times, you got compensated accordingly. Which was completely unfair. But they had to relive these experiences, and many of them were paid $60,000 or $5,000, whatever they're paid. And many of them, it re-traumatized them to the point where many of them have subsequently died, either drank themselves to death or committed suicide or just ceased to want to live. So you know, we don't really seem to get that we're humans. We have frailties, we have grief, we have all those pieces. And when we start to dredge around too much or demand proof, we end up having creating a whole other new kind of a problem. So just so you know, I mean, those are things that I don't think are Canadianly, like put into the Canadian news on a very regular basis. So you don't necessarily get an opportunity to understand that a lot of what has happened and tried to be dealt with is still being dealt with in a punitive manner. And you know, we shouldn't be doing that. Absolutely not.
Yeah. Wow. And let's see, MJ, would you be interested in kind of, you have more of a comment and also kind of a question that you might pose to the community as a whole?
Yeah, just listening to all this today, it's been really very interesting. So thank you both to Cynthia and to Sylvia. Thank you so much. But certainly it does make me think a little bit about church school, you know, and what we're doing across the country and in various, you know, Christian churches. You need to educate the educators. And I don't know if there's, I know it's early days, I think, you know, for us, but we need to educate the educators. So how do we tell the stories we've heard today, you know, just that combination of creation stories, as well as an indigenous worldview, even as we're introducing young people to Christianity.
Well, one thing,
Go
ahead, finish.
No, just so it makes me think a little bit about it. I don't know what the answer is, and just trying to understand if there's any thought about that right now and what's happening.
But one thing, I know Sylvia will speak to this too. One thing I think is really important is that you know, what Sylvia had to say about how Christianity is understood needs to be amended, first of all. So you're teaching the creation stories, and you're teaching, you know, all of those pieces. They need to be broadened, and they need to be elevated, so that the way you're teaching them is different than dominion over, you know, that it brings it down to that place. And then I had a student that came into my office when I was in Thunder Bay, Lakehead, and she said, you know, my daughter came back from school today, and they taught what's the contact story, you know, they sailed the ocean blue and they arrived, and you know, this is then the world began, kind of thing, right? The opposite of what Plenty Coups had to say. And she said, and I said, what happened? And she said, well, my daughter called her a liar, right? So she said, I don't really know what to do. And I said, well, one of the things I would do is, you know, don't go in and get in a fight with the teacher, because the teacher's teaching the Columbus story because that's the story she knows, right? That's the story she's told to teach. So go in and give her several other stories, creation stories and other stories, and have her understand that the Columbus story is just one story, that there are many other stories, and so that the kids have a broader experience of education, and the church can do the same. So everything needs to be age appropriate, right? We don't teach about residential schools and the atrocities that happen there, the sexual violence, to kindergartners, but kindergartners understand being taken away from their parents, and they understand the sense of loss. You know, I mean, even if there's a divorce, they understand the sense of, I lost my dad or I lost my mom. To be able to understand that children were taken away from both parents and for a very long period of time, like a year, or sometimes for some of these kids, 10 years. They never saw their families for 10 years. They never left those schools. They understand that. And so, you know, they understand teachers, you know, if teachers are cruel, or if teachers do, you know, things that are unpleasant, they understand that. So, and then all the way up to high school and all the way through to, you know, to universities, where we teach the story a lot more graphically, I suppose, because they can handle it. You know, it's age appropriate. But I would start with, and there's some amazing books that have been published around residential schools for children that actually very much address it from the perspective that they can understand and absorb and know. And because, I mean, you know, I was talking to a gal yesterday, Pam Toulouse, who was a university professor, and she said that one of the kids she was talking to grade 3 class, and the kid said, well, what do you do? Well, why would a teacher be mean? Right? And then, you know, so they had this conversation, and you know, why would people send their kids to school if the school was bad? Well, because there was the law that said they had to. Right, that was the law. So there was different ways of addressing it. But Sylvia, I'm sure you have something to say about how to teach this.
Well, one place I was going to start, Cynthia, was actually with what you just said about there are some very, very good books out about the residential school experience. There are picture books for younger kids, other books slightly older. The challenge with the Sunday school teaching, well, there's a couple of things. One is we have tended to teach our Sunday school stories as you know, moral lessons, and which kind of abstracts the stories from that larger narrative. And so I was trying to think, like, what are some ways to pair those books with what you're teaching in, say, a Sunday school class? And there's no curriculum that does this kind of a thing. But, you know, if you happened to be in a Sunday school class talking about injustice, say, in the way the Bible talks about that, then you have these books, right? I mean, you could parallel it with a story like Joseph being sold by his brothers into, you know, to the Chaldeans and into slavery. But then that story is often told as just a moral story about having trust in God, except there's a heck of a lot more going on there. I mean, here's my frustration. I was actually talking with Andrew Asbill before COVID about a position with the diocese where I would create curriculum that would integrate themes around creation and some of these other things into a Sunday school curriculum that was actually usable for our churches. COVID hit, and you know, the diocese is not hiring for that kind of stuff, even though I think it's more important than some other things, because and unless we start, actually, our Sunday school curriculums are put together by people who are good at writing curriculum. They're not put together by people who actually you know, they don't call in biblical scholars for this very much. And so that's our biggest challenge and our biggest problem. So, you know, I teach one course a year at Trinity, and these people become priests, a lot of them, and I hope that somehow that's going to trickle down into the churches. But really, I think as churches, we need to take a more proactive approach and just say, it would be worth sinking some money into hiring somebody to produce something for us that we can use in our churches, that will tell the indigenous stories, that will talk about creation, that will undermine the whole cultural mindset that a dominating version of Christianity has created. So MJ, if you want to go put pressure on the bishop, that would be great.
There was a book written, I think it was a Beardy, actually, from up north in Northern Ontario. And I think it was for the Anglican Church. I remember having it. It got somebody must have borrowed it and never brought it back. But I got it at the library that is on Bloor and Church. Right at the top there, there's some, is it Anglican? I'm not even sure. But anyway, I'll see if I can look it up and find it for you, and I'll send it over to Karen. But it does exactly what you're saying. It sort of says, well, yes, here's two perspectives sort of juxtaposition with each other, so you can see when you're teaching this how you can do it in a good way. But yeah, there's an interesting, anyway, I think we're kind of at the time here. I'll hand it back to Karen, but I just want to say thank you to everybody for what was a really great conversation. I thought it was very helpful. It was certainly helpful to me. So thank you, Sylvia. Thanks for all the questions. Yeah.
And I the same thing. Thank you, Cynthia. That was just so illuminating, and the questions were really great questions. So this felt like a very not just a hopeful discussion, but a discussion that I have a sense people want to carry this forward in ways, and that's always a great feeling at the end.
Thank you. I think that it is true that we have been on holy ground this morning, and I think you have each thanked each other, and I think I can speak for all of the participants to say thank you to both of you for the thoughtfulness and the honesty that you have brought to this discussion. I just want to share, I looked up a Facebook post that my wonderful daughter-in-law, Robin, put in a couple of days ago. I just want to read her post. This is stereotypical of Robin. My grandson is 4 years old and started junior kindergarten this week. So she says, the 4-year-old, why is tomorrow Orange Shirt Day? Me, mangled preschool version of residential schools. 4-year-old, but I didn't want them to do that. Would they take me away? Then she puts 3 broken hearts. I can't tell if this is a fail or not. I'm not ready for kids old enough to ask these questions. Can I go back to just keeping them alive? And then an edit. At dinner, he also randomly asked, can you sell people? Sigh. I said no and left it at that. Today is not the day for another 4-year-old history lesson in human atrocities.
I hear you there. Yeah, that's a real problem. But those are the kids that are being born right now. So we need to be ready for that too, and make sure that they get the nurturing and the stories and that kind of love that they need. You know, we got another opportunity. Every day we have another opportunity to do it better. So I think we should really make effort to make sure that that happens. And all the stories that you guys hold in your heads and in your hearts, they need to have those. Absolutely.
And to provide support and resources to parents who are trying, and teachers who are trying very hard to be woke and to tell it, to do it right, but they need the support and resources and wisdom to do that. So thank you. We will send out the reading list. This, just to repeat, this has been recorded. It will be posted. I think they're still trying to sort out whether it will be on the Church of Redeemers website or on their YouTube channel. I don't, whether Amber, you have anything further to add about that, but it will be available. So I think that this is worthy of being recorded and repeated and shared with people. So we are stopping right on time.
All right.
So
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.